Hi, everyone. We'll start shortly. Can everyone take their seats? I would like to invite G20 Sherpa, Mr. Amitabh and the co-convener of the Independent Expert Group, Mr. N.K. Singh, to join us in the panel. I would also like to invite Mr. Hari Menon. You can't hear. I would also like to invite Mr. Hari Menon to please join us on the panel. Okay.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ICRIER's
Can you ask them to sit?
Can everyone please take their seat? We're just about to start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to ICRIER's 15th Annual International G20 Conference. The title for this edition of the conference is Taking the Indian Presidency's Priorities Forward, Road to the Rio de Janeiro Summit. We have an insightful day planned for everyone today. The event will start with the inaugural session, followed by two panel discussions on topics closely related to India's G20 agenda going forward. I would like to now invite Dr. Deepak Mishra, the Director and Chief Executive of ICRIER, to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you. Very good afternoon to all our esteemed guests, colleagues, and participants joining us here today, both in person as well as online. On behalf of the Indian Council of Research and International Economic Relations, ICRIER, it is my pleasure to welcome you all to our 2024 G20 Annual International Conference, being held in partnership with Gates Foundation and ADBI Institute. ICRIER has been celebrating and working on G20 long before G20 became a household name in India. And I hope this conference series will continue as long as G20 exists. Last year was, of course, special, with India holding the G20 presidency. By any yardstick, Indian G20 presidency was considered to be highly successful with many tangible outcomes. But what you may not know is that India G20 presidency was also the most popular G20 presidency in its history. Can I put the slide back, please? As per the Google trend, more people search the word G20 during Indian presidency than any other G20 event. So it is quite special when we have among us one of the main architects of India G20 success, Mr. Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa for India, and ICRIER's latest board member. It's a huge honor and pleasure to have you, Mr. Kant, here. Among the many priorities of India's G20 presidency, the one that was infused with the most intellectual capital and the one that is likely to be most enduring, and here I'm being completely unbiased, is the reform of the multilateral development banks. So it's a huge honor and a pleasure to have with us Mr. N.K. Singh here, who so admirably steered the independent expert group on MDB reforms as one of its co-conveners. We also have Vera Songwe, one of the IG members, as well as the author of the famous Songwe-Stern report on climate finance. The IG worked seamlessly with the finance ministry colleagues in India. Some of them are here and some of them are not here. They'll be joining us soon by the first session. A special welcome to Mr. Ajay Seth, DA Secretary, Deputy Sherpa for the Finance Track, who so eloquently presented the volume 1 of the IG report to the G20 deputies in Gandhinagar last year. Unfortunately, Mrs. Seth has been called to make a presentation at the FM, so he won't be coming, but the rest of the MOF crowds will be here soon. We also will have Mr. Anand Nageshwar, the Chief Economic Advisor, and the intellectual force behind many of the ideas pursued in the finance track, as well as several MOF colleagues who played critical role behind the scene to ensure the G20 finance ministers and central bank governors accept the IG recommendation. In fact, you can see the picture of the Team India on the screen here. You have FM and then Mr. Singh next to her, sandwich between Janet Yellen and Finance Minister. But behind the next row, which you can't see very clearly, most of the people whose name I mentioned and I'll be mentioning were all there, part of the Team India supporting the Finance Ministry in its work on the finance track. Supporting the IG work was a core team of experts drawn from CGD, Center for Global Development, Brookings, ODI, and ICRIER, as shown in this picture. We have many of the core team members here among us, and some of them will be speaking during today's session, including Mr. Masood Ahmed from CGD and one of the policy advisors to the IG. We also have Mr. Suma Chakrabarti, the chair of the Board of Trustee of ODI, as well as Mr. Anil Kishora from New Development Bank, who will be joining online, and Augusto Kwame, the country director of World Bank India, all of whom will be speaking in the session immediately following the inaugural session. Apart from the MDB reforms, the notable priorities for Indian presidency were mainstreaming the concept of digital public infrastructures, which is pursued through the Digital Economy Working Group as well as through the Global Partnership for Financial Inclusion. And that's why we choose to have the second session of the conference on financial inclusion through DPIs-led innovation. The discussion for this session will be led by many people, including Mr. Chanchal Sarkar, who just stepped in, the co-chair for the GPFI working group, Mr. Dilip Aspe, MD and CEO of National Payment Corporation of India, Ms. Mahal Dimachki, the head of the Innovation Hub Singapore Center BIS, and she'll be joining online, as well as Ms. Nontebeko Lubisi, Director of Finance Inclusion, National Treasury, South Africa. So that will be part of the second session for the day. Many of our speakers were not only deeply involved in the Indian G20 presidency, but also closely following what's happening in Brazil, as well as planning to deepen the engagement with South Africa and the United States, the next two G20 presidencies. So we'll be hearing from them a bit of a reflection of the Indian presidency and how they're being pursued in Brazil and what could be achieved in South Africa. Most of the work that ICRIER does in this space has been made possible by generous support of Gates Foundation and ADB Institute. So I'm deeply grateful to both Mr. Hari Menon and Mr. Peter Morgan, who will be also joining us online from Manila, for being part of today's event. The two topics we are going to discuss today, MDB reforms and financial inclusion, have been around for years and decades. By shining a spotlight on them, Indian G20 presidency has brought greater awareness and more urgency to the reform in these areas. ICRIER, CGT, ODI have been regularly monitoring MDB reforms, and some of this activity will also be undertaken during the World Bank IMF annual meeting in Washington in the coming weeks. On the DPI front, there's been a lot happened in the last few months since the India's presidency. As we speak, nearly 500 delegates from around the world have gathered in Cairo for the first global DPI summit. In ICRIER, we have had an exciting program on DPIs, including the launch of the Community of Practice for Think Tanks on DPIs, what we call the DPI4D, Digital Public Infrastructure for Development, last month in partnership with Gates Foundation. So we had 25 think tanks around the world joining us in this program, and this is a program that has been funded by Gates Foundation. So we're really happy that something that's coming out of India is actually getting diffused across the world. The Indian G20 presidency is over, but the priorities that India put forward have endured. Today's conference is a testimony to that. In the next 3 hours, you'll be hearing from some of the most thoughtful and well-informed experts in this area. So once again, welcome to the 2024 G20 Annual International Conference. And let me introduce you to the next speaker, which will be Mr. N.K. Singh. It's been a huge honor and a privilege for ICRIER and personally for me to have the opportunity to work with Mr. Singh for the past 18 to 12 months. Apart from being the co-convener of G20 expert group on MDB reforms, Mr. Singh is the president of Institute of Economic Growth, chairman of the 15th Finance Commission as well. He has put on many hats over the 6 decades of a very distinguished public life, from being a bureaucrat, member of parliament, economist, academician, and a policy interlocutor. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Singh to deliver the inaugural address of this conference. Thank you.
Whatever it's your call, you heard the, so why not give me the mic? Yeah, mic is mic. Oh, I'm already. Yeah. All right. Let's go. Well, thank you very much, Deepak, for your kind words, and I really value this opportunity to speak on the issues of the India's G20 presidency, the issues of an enduring nature, and how we see the path forward to Rio and beyond. And you talked of India's G20, the reputation which it acquired by word of mouth in terms of what the world felt, even though he is a colleague of mine, I must really, to your embarrassment, Amitabh, say that you are the quintessential master, so to say, of whichever responsibility you have been. You have raised the level and quality of the organizations with which you have worked, and I'll join others in really underlining the well-deserved appreciation and the well-deserved earth. And as your role at the Sherpa on the G20, I guess Deepak expects that the obligation of shouldering it to all the discussions today to Rio and beyond Rio in Johannesburg would rest on your very able shoulders. Deepak, you want me to talk about a subject. Many of the architects, and I'm using the word architects very carefully, on the MDB reforms are present in this room. Of course, these reports would not have been possible without Mr. Masood Ahmed. He has been the continuing pillar of support. Veera, of course, was a member of the independent expert group, and I'm particularly delighted. Suma, not only you personally, but your organization gave such great support to the work of the IEG in multiple ways that enabled us to make recommendations which were succinct and which were meaningful. Where do we stand in terms of... I'd also like to mention, Mr. Menon, that the support of the foundation has been has had a catalytic impact on continuing the work. And continuing the work I regard as the most important outcome, because these recommendations are unlikely to be implemented by any particular government. They are over a period of time, but keeping awareness alive, keeping people engaged is an important ingredient in enabling the consciousness of the world and the conscience of the world to remain ignited. Because at the end of the day, G20 is an intergovernmental body. It derives support only from one particular aspect, which is a conscience of the world and the feeling of global interdependence. I spent the last 3 days with my other co-convener, Professor Larry Summers. Deepak was also involved in one of those discussions, and many others. The director of the country director of the World Bank, Tana, was involved in one of those. Nice sort of thing. So to some extent, where do we stand? In my view, I think that it will be fair to say that there has been some success, but huge disappointments too. Success in terms of the fact that the initiative on the MDB reforms did enhance the recognition on the need to what we described in our first report, which is the triple agenda, tripling the mandate beyond poverty and beyond shared prosperity to certainly include climate as an important aspect of the same strategy on poverty and shared prosperity. There is much greater recognition today that you need to work towards a livable planet than it existed before, perhaps, our report. And this, I must say, is not a minor gain for the multilateral development families to recognize as a whole on the need to include climate as an important ingredient. So that is a very plus thing. And I think that this brilliant survey, if I may mention you, Deepak, the orchestration of the stock-taking report, along with a brilliant team which you have. I see Tanu here and others who have kept themselves going to constantly update this stock-taking report, brings out very clearly that one of the areas where there is distinct progress is for an overall recognition that you need to broaden the mandate or the agenda and the principal objective of the multilateral development banks to include also issues of climate and climate prosperity. Having said this, what has been the progress in terms of our second report, which is the idea of better, bolder, and a bigger bank? Well, on that, one must confess that there's an old adage that you can take a horse to water, you cannot force it to drink. These two reports have taken the horse, in this case, the shareholders, to water, but we cannot force the shareholders to really imbibe the virtues of taking vital decisions. And I think that, Amitabh, this is something which you might like to keep in mind, that if ever, and I've discussed this with Mr. Masood and with you also, Deepak, that if we were to do an update on the two reports which we gave on the MDB and the 30 recommendations, what would that third volume be? And the third volume, in my view, would be concentrated on two things. On the shareholders' obligations. These two volumes bring out the obligations of the multilateral development banks as a whole, but the shareholders need to recognize that the multilateral development banks are only as nimble and as powerful as the shareholders choose to make them. And a lot of what has not happened in terms of improving processes, procedures, of the functioning of the multilateral development banks is because I think that the shareholders need to really nudge these multilateral development banks and lend support. For instance, anecdotally, I don't see too much, and I think the country director can correct me if I'm wrong, that, the quest of bringing down the time for processing proposals on average of about 23, 24 months to around, say, 12 months. The World Bank themselves took a target for themselves. And I must say that the evolution map of the World Bank at every important conference is an update in some ways, marking progress. But progress on a dramatic change in the time frame entails processes and procedures. And many of these processes and procedures are embedded in the decision-making process currently that the shareholders have put in place. Or, for instance, in terms of building robust technical platforms in country platforms with a deep engagement of the owners of that country, and a robust pipeline of bankable projects, the general feel is that the progress, talking, and Veera, you can correct me, of what's going on in the African continent, but the progress on that again appears to be somewhat modest. Or for instance, you take a parameter like the ability to fully harness the capital adequacy framework report, which was initiated under the Indonesian presidency. And we are working, as Amitabh will point out, on a Troika principle. The progress on fully harnessing the amount of resources which can be made available through the capital adequacy framework report has also been a mixed one. And this is partly because each of the multilateral development banks are governed by their own typology of accountability, their own processes and procedures. Or, for instance, the very vital one of whether MDBs, instead of acting in silos, each MDB in a silo, with MDB as a family. And this is a bigger thing than this word can encapsulate, acting as a family. It entails a whole host of things on going beyond, and I say this with tongue in cheek, that one of the things which was mentioned to me is that we now have an annual retreat as part of the MDBs getting together. But surely the need to work as a family goes beyond annual retreats and things like that. So I think it will be fair to say that on the MDBs becoming better and acting cohesively, the progress has been one where there's a long way to go. In terms of becoming bolder would mean informed risk decisions instead of excessive risk averseness. And that is one of the critical factors there would be, have they been successful in being able to harness private capital? I mean, currently, if you add all MDBs, you are really harnessing about $60 billion of just $60 billion of private capital. Can you take it to 400 billion? Because on that harnessing of private capital, the rest of the architecture is based. And the progress on being able to harness private capital, actually, very frankly, with the recognition of the intention and the willingness of the bank, I think that it goes beyond merely setting up a private sector lab. The lab is doing great work. It has some of the best minds on that subject. But the ground level picture today, in spite of having set up that lab some time ago, is that private capital still remains averse, whether on account of risk mitigation, regulatory uncertainties, the use of guarantees in a more dynamic way, in terms of multiple forms of financial innovation. It remains certainly risk averse. Last, on the issue of a bigger MDB, the bigger is based on two important factors. One is the fact of whether the ability to harness the existing balance sheet, which entails on the fullest implementation of the capital adequacy framework report, on which progress is there, but somewhat modest. But more importantly, and that's where I mentioned that the engagement of the shareholders become necessary, that you can kick the can down by saying that let them do X, Y, and Z before you come to that. But I think that the market is not getting the signal that the shareholders are fully behind the MDBs in substantially increasing the operations and the extent of financing of the MDBs. And till that signal changes through action which the market perceives are credible, I think we will still be playing with incremental changes and not transformative changes. So let me end by saying that it's not all gloom, because I think that there is tangible progress from the time when we began in terms of certainly enhanced awareness. There are other uncertainties that the geopolitics, the fragmentation, the slow but definite balkanization of the world in terms of, in multiple ways, the increase and intensity of the ongoing regional conflicts and the engagement of the focus of the decision makers on that, plus the uncertainties surrounding some important electoral outcomes a couple of months down the line, who also are important shareholders in this. All this really leads us inevitably to one conclusion. And that conclusion, Mr. Menon, has something to do with you, that the need to keep the world engaged and focused and to really bring at every conceivable moment that we need to keep this dialogue going so as to have constant stock taking of the kind and quality which Deepak, your team, working in tandem with the team from Dr. Masood's organization is able to put together. With these words, let me say that this is an important document, an important moment for stock taking, as we recognize, and I think that we must factor in the outcome of the special summit of the United Nations, and from which the Indian Prime Minister had just come back from looking to the future, as we prepare the road not only to the G20 in Rio, where we look forward to the continuation of this process of the New Delhi Declaration, which has been in many ways adopted by the Brazilian presidency. Not only look forward to that, but we look forward to, of course, in more proximate terms, to two other important things. One is the annual meeting of the bank and the fund, which is a great moment to look at the new evolution map which the World Bank would put together to the Development Committee. And before I say, we have reached a stage when I'm sure, and that Dr. Masood will speak more about this, we reached a stage when perhaps we must realize that concentrating on multilateral development banks, leaving out the International Monetary Fund would be a grave mistake. Professor Lawrence Summers mentioned the fact that 2 or 3 important recommendations of our own group out of the 30 greatly impinge on the working of the International Monetary Fund. And he mentioned only one fact. I don't know whether it was your meeting or not, but certainly he mentioned in the small meeting which the finance minister had hosted with some senior officials, he did mention that look at the attitude of the International Monetary Fund, that on the question of the creation of the SDRs, when they were initially created, look at what the gold was at that time and what is gold today, and have the SDRs in any way reflected the fact of the change in the quantum. And looking at the great unfulfilled needs on climate and on climate financing, have they got their act together? The fact that the 2 important funds which were created by the International Monetary Fund, which has resources, only a small fraction of that, an infinitesimal fraction of that, has actually been harnessed and put to purpose of use, underlines the necessity of bringing in the reforms of not only MDBs, but as you put, Deepak, in your paper, MDB plus. The plus in this case entails the changes in the International Monetary Fund. So those are vital to discussions around the restructuring of the international financial architecture. So I think that these are all important issues, and we would look forward to our continuing engagement and the outcome of today's meeting. Thank you very much, Deepak.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Singh. That was a wonderful exposition of the context for the rest of the conference, especially for the session one. I think the message that the MDB reform has been a mixed bag with some very tangible outcomes, but also significant disappointment, which tells us there's a lot of work to be done ahead. And we are, at least with both with Gates and other partners, we are working pretty steadily on keeping the pressure on to publish reports and outcomes on time. And I think the working with CGD, Brookings, and ODI has been a real pleasure. And I think it's been a very fruitful partnership, and you'll be seeing a lot more of that soon. But let me now turn to introduce Mr. Amitabh Kant. Mr. Amitabh Kant is a distinguished leader in public policy and one of India's finest administrators. As India's G20 Sherpa, he played a critical role in making India's G20 presidency a resounding success. Mr. Kant has spearheaded transformative initiatives such as Startup India, Make in India, and Incredible India. Known as a decisive thinker and a clear speaker with a can-do attitude, Mr. Kant has worked across various ministries in the state and center. His work has been pivotal in repositioning India on the global stage, aligning nicely with ICRIER mission, which is where he is now one of our newest board members, on linking India with the world. So we are honored and delighted to welcome Mr. Kant to give the keynote address for today's conference. I think whatever you feel. It's already there. Your mic is already there.
So let me first thank Mr. N.K. Singh, who's been my guru for many years, has been one of the most distinguished civil servants India has ever produced. He's given you a perspective of his expert committee report, which he produced along with Larry Summers. But let me say that we are meeting at a point of time when there are very major geographical seismic shifts taking place. We are meeting at a point of time when big power conflict is back center stage. And we are seeing a prolonged war in the heart of Europe, which has gone on for about 3 years now. We are seeing Middle East up in flames. In Russia-Ukraine war, close to about 40,000 people have died, but in the Middle East, there's a huge humanitarian crisis, but over 300,000 people have died in a much shorter time span. We are also seeing an increased threat of China as far as annexation of Taiwan is concerned. And therefore, geopolitically, the scenario which India was confronted with when we hosted the G20 and now seems to have got even more aggravated at the point of time when Brazil is hosting the presidency. So one is that we are confronted with a global conflict right now. The second key issue is that we are confronted with a scenario where global value chains have completely broken down. We had recently seen America imposing 100% duty on electric vehicles on China, 50% on solar panels, and 25% on steel and aluminum. And Biden said that we are determined to dominate these industries because China has over the years used state subsidy to support many of these industries where it has penetrated globally. And if you look at some of these sectors, in solar, they control about almost 70% of the global supply. They control about 68% in electric vehicles. And in many of the raw materials which are critical, they are controlling almost 75% of the global supply. The response has been through a very muscular industrial policy by the United States, through its Inflation Reduction Act, through its CHIP Act, which brings back industrial policy center stage in trade wars. And this is critical because global economy, if you have to lift people above the poverty line, then balanced, sustainable, inclusive growth is critical. And without growth, you can't eliminate hunger and poverty. You can't bring sustainable development back, goals center stage. And according to IMF, the world will grow at about 3.2%. Advanced countries will grow at 1.8%. Emerging markets will grow at about close to 4.3%. And actually, in the next 2 to 3 decades, emerging markets will contribute to almost 2/3 of the global growth. And that means that if 2/3 of the global growth is going to come from global south, multilateral development banks and financial institutions need to be realigned for the requirement of global south. And this is critical because the western part of the world will be aging. US, Europe will all be aging, whereas Asia and Africa will be getting younger and younger in the coming decades. And the third key challenge which the world is confronted with is the emergence of new technologies. Artificial intelligence, quantum computing, biosciences, semiconductors, all this will enhance global productivity and raise it in a very significant manner. They will have a huge impact as far as learning outcomes, health outcomes, transforming the lives of citizens are concerned. But the basic assumptions on which they are based, the ethical norms on which they are based, they all require international agreement. And that will be critical because they can be used for conflicts around the world. And therefore, much like atomic energy, you need international cooperation. There is no other global body which is equipped to handle many of these global crises, the conflict, the breakdown of global value chains, the emergence of new technologies. There's no other body at present, no other multilateral body which is equipped. And multilateralism had taken a big retreat till India brought G20 back center stage with consensus on all the 83 paras. There's no other body to my mind which is equipped other than G20. It's the only body which comprises of G7, of Russia, China, and of emerging markets, and which comprises of today almost 90% of the population and almost close to about 80% of the global GDP. And therefore, it's important and critical that G20, when it is hosted in emerging markets from Indonesia to India to Brazil and subsequently to South Africa, brings in energy, vibrancy, and dynamism to reshape global policies. And this is critical for the world. India demonstrated its great ability to bring everybody together and to bring consensus on a range of issues. And to my mind, the first and foremost issue critical to the world is to drive global growth. And that is the basic foundation on which G20 was initiated. And growth is critical, and that would require G20 members to drive global trade. Trade has lifted vast segments of population above the poverty line. What we are seeing today is protectionism at its best. And WTO is virtually a dead organization. It's a non-functional body. It's on a range of, for a vast variety of reasons, it's non-functional. And unless and until global trade is brought back center stage, it'll be difficult for the world to grow. Investment and trade drives growth. And to my mind, that is critical. Until growth doesn't come center stage, it'll be very difficult to focus on sustainable development goals. We are all aware that only 12 of the outcomes are on track. The rest of the SDGs are not on track. And we had, as a part of our recommendations, come out with an SDG action plan till 2030, which would accelerate the pace of sustainable development goals. And I think Brazil's focus is on global alliance against hunger and poverty. But any alliance against hunger and poverty would require both growth and would require a huge emphasis on improving nutritional standards, improving learning outcomes and health outcomes. This is critical to my mind. But all this would also require the use of technology in a very big way. And therefore, in our presidency, we had focused very strongly on technological transformation and the digital public infrastructure. Our own experience demonstrates that a model of digital public infrastructure, we could provide identity to citizens and use that identity to provide 2.2 billion COVID vaccination and ensure that we were able to put money into the bank accounts of the people during the COVID period and ensure that they do not fall below the poverty line. We today do about 50% of the real-time fast payment in the world. China is next with about 22%. And from fast payment, we moved to providing credit to people below poverty line without any leakages. And over 700 schemes of the government, we put money directly into the bank account of citizens. We then moved between 2015 and 2017, we had opened about 550 million bank accounts, and we linked them with both Aadhaar and the mobile number. And today it's enabled over many of our young startups to take the stock market to tier 2, tier 3 cities and rural areas. And many of these young startups like Zerodha, Grow Up Stock, control almost 30% of India's stock market. And then we had a number of insurance companies like Go Digit and Acco, which provide insurance in less than a minute on the mobile, on the go. So India has demonstrated that from fast payment to credit to stock market to insurance, you can do transactions on the back of digital public infrastructure between 30 seconds and 1 minute. And put money into the bank accounts of citizens without any leakages. Now, this system is very different from the big tech model of the West, which has been led by Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and in China by Tencent and Alibaba. Our model is open source, open API, globally interoperable. We build a digital public layer on top of which we've allowed private sector to innovate and compete in the market space. And to my mind, during G20 in India, both the definition and the framework was accepted. And if you have to lift people above poverty line, if you have to attack hunger and poverty, improve learning outcomes and health outcomes, the only way is to technologically leapfrog. There is no other way. India demonstrated this, and the reason why we could build 40 million houses in the last 7 years, and that's like building one Australia, we could provide water to 253 million citizens, that's like providing water to every citizen of Brazil, and we could provide 130 million citizens with toilets, and that's like making a toilet for every citizen of Brazil, was all because of the digital public infrastructure. We could do it speedily because we could do digital identification. And therefore, the Bank of International Settlement said that what India has achieved in 7 years would have taken 46 years to achieve. Now, this is the model which is critical. Technologically transforming the world for SDGs is critical for the world. And that is what we are pushing during the Brazilian presidency as a Troika member. This is key. This is, to my mind, critical. And the third most critical thing is on climate action and the need for providing adequate financial resources to the global south. 2023 has been the hottest year in the history of the world, and 24th July 24 has been the hottest day in the history of the world. And it is, while many of the emerging markets in the global south are not responsible for this, 80% of the carbon space has been occupied by the developed world, but irrespective of that, it's necessary that, and much like India has demonstrated that it wants to be the first country in the world to urbanize and industrialize through a process of decarbonization. We've built close to 200 gigawatt of renewable energy. We've now planning to become a champion of green hydrogen. We import worth about 170 billion worth of fossil fuel. Our aim is that by 2047, we'll be the biggest exporter of clean energy through green hydrogen and be the biggest exporter of ammonia as green hydrogen in its liquid form and be the biggest manufacturer of electrolyzer. We've also demonstrated using the size and scale of India that we can bring down prices. We procured 400 million LED bulbs and brought down their costs to about 15% of their original price. We procured 7,000 buses for 6 cities of India and demonstrated that the cost of an electric bus could be 12% cheaper than fossil fuel buses. This could be done because we were using the size and scale of India and bring in population scale impact. And our view is that in the coming years, the next round of bidding we are doing for 10,000 electric buses, and the third round is for 30,000 electric buses. We believe that net zero is net positive. We believe that instead of paying a green premium, many economists say that when you move from fossil fuel to clean fuel, you pay a green premium. India has demonstrated that it can do it with a green discount. And therefore, we pushed with great ambition the Green Development Pact during India's presidency. We pushed for tripling renewable energy. We pushed for doubling of energy efficiency. We pushed for green hydrogen. We pushed for biofuel alliance. We pushed for greater allocation of resources for the emerging markets. We pushed for greater resources for clean energy because of our belief that climate action is critical for the world. And because this can happen, these are all overlapping multiple crises. SDG, climate action, all are overlapping crises. And they would require resources for emerging markets. And therefore, I'm glad that some of these issues are being taken forward by Brazil in a very vigorous manner. They've also pushing for TF Clima, which is presently under negotiation in Brazil. And lastly, the last point about reform of the multilateral institution about which Mr. N.K. Singh has spoken at length. And his report has been widely debated and discussed, so I would not speak at length except saying that touching on the last point, that it is critical that while his report largely focuses on the World Bank and the reform for that and the need for $3 trillion, I would merely say that there is no shortage of resources. Firstly, there are $300 trillion available, $150 trillion available with sovereign wealth funds and pension funds. They do not find access to emerging markets in the global south because the risks are many more. And it is necessary to mitigate these risks through the use of MIGA by the World Bank, which needs to become a far more effective institution. And I'm not getting into procedural issues because Mr. Singh has covered them at length, but it's necessary to use the private resources and use the multiplier impact of that. It's also necessary that to understand that almost 60% of the carbon space in the world is only 1% of the companies are responsible for that, for them. And therefore, there is a need to put out data in public domain. And this data on what is the extent of carbon being emitted by each one of these large companies needs to be put out in public domain so that the market recognizes who's emitting how much of carbon space. And therefore, the market will ultimately penalize them. And it's not countries which will be able to drive this. It'll be the market which must become the key arbitrator, key deciders on this by penalizing companies which are emitting and occupying carbon space in the world. That, to my mind, is critical. And lastly, it's while Mr. Singh's report has largely touched upon the World Bank, it is critical, as he said, to focus on a strengthened and a reformed International Monetary Fund. Because the IMF's policy, if 2/3 of the global growth, as IMF says, is going to come for the next 3 decades from global south, its policies have worked against the interests of global south. And therefore, how do you provide greater resources for global south? How do you provide for greater access to its balance sheet to ensure resources for emerging markets to grow, which have younger population? And how do you, for instance, Indonesia and US do not have access to US dollar swap lines, and they use their own resources to access them, which means a huge amount of resources being occupied, which impacts their own balance sheet. And therefore, how do you reform these institutions to work for the interest of global growth? And by that, I mean growth of emerging markets, and the time to act is now. And therefore, as Troika members, we are working very responsibly with Brazil. We work in partnership with them to drive some of these key agendas of both global growth, SDGs, climate action, and technological transformation. And much of the work is to begin now, because then in the next 15 days, there'll be 10 ministerial meetings. The climate and energy will be a very contested issue, as we were confronted with. And lastly, as I mentioned, as I started off with, will be the very critical para on geopolitics, which is going through a very, with this global crisis right now, center stage, both in Europe and Middle East being in flames, will be very contested para, word by word, letter by letter, and therefore it'll be a huge challenge. But these are very tough times for the world, and we look forward to supporting Brazil. But the time to act on many of these growth issues of lifting people above poverty line and of assisting and supporting Global South, the time to act is now. Thank you very much, lady.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good.
Sit down. Thank you, Mr. Kant. I think you started by saying that India brought infused energy, vibrancy, and dynamism to G20. I think you just did that to this room. I think that was a terrific speech. Thank you so much. And of course, you laid out a very nice set of agendas. We could not accommodate the climate change session, which if we had to do another session, that would have been our topic. But thank you so much. Now, let me introduce Mr. Hari Menon. Hari is the director of the Gates Foundations of India's country office. He also serves as the foundation's, he also oversees the foundation work in South and Southeast Asia in his role as the director of the India office. Mr. Menon oversees the foundation work in various sectors from family health, nutrition, sanitation, digital finance and inclusion, agriculture, women's economic empowerment. He leads these efforts to advance India's health and development goals by working closely with India's central and state governments, local and global non-profits, community groups, researchers, and the private sector. And personally, we have a very strong relationship with Gates Foundation. About 18 months ago, we signed our first MOU, and it has been a terrific partnership because a lot of the areas that we are working on in terms of taking India G20 practices ahead are actually being supported by Gates. So I'm really grateful, Hari, for coming. And can I request you to give the concluding remarks? Thank you.
Thanks, Deepak, for the kind introduction. And let me start by thanking you and the ICRIER team for pulling together this very important group for this conversation. As Mr. Singh reminded us, the G20 agenda that India laid out last year takes on some very complicated issues, and reform of many of those requires concerted, continuous engagement. And so, as you pointed out, keeping up the dialogue, keeping up the engagement, creating platforms to bring together stakeholders and organizations from around the world is something we at the Gates Foundation are delighted to be able to do with ICRIER, with stakeholders from the Government of India and global partners, including ODI, Brookings, CGD, and others. For me, it's a privilege to occupy the stage with two giants of modern India in Mr. Singh and Mr. Kant. Both of them laid out in very compelling terms the importance of sustaining the momentum and the energy that has come out of the recent G20 presidencies of leading countries from the global south. Indonesia, followed by India, Brazil this year, heading into South Africa next year. This is a unique confluence, I would say, of country presidencies at a time when the world is going through change. Mr. Kant mentioned the geopolitical ferment that we are going through, but these times of chaos are also opportunities to lay the foundation for what will be a new world order. What we are going through in this decade is not unlike what the world went through 100 years ago, and what that led to subsequently with the Bretton Woods institutions and very fundamental reform set the stage for several decades of global growth and inclusion. And as Mr. Khan said, that is the agenda that we need to refocus ourselves on, but in a world that looks very different and where the dynamics of political power, economic growth, and social transformation are going to come from very different parts of the world. The global south is going to emerge, one hopes, in a much more as a prime driver of some of that change, because the impacts of a lot of what is going on right now are felt most keenly in the global south. And India's presidency, as it has laid out in various areas, Mr. Kant mentioned the list, and one could go top to bottom, many of them. Just touch upon a few. I think the digital public infrastructure agenda, that is a leapfrog opportunities for many countries, particularly those that are graduating from LMIC to middle income, both for what it offers governments as a means to improve governance, but also as a means for citizens to demand and receive better services from government and other stakeholders. The transparency and efficiency that it has brought into a country like India is something that allows even partners like us. We do a lot of our work in states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which for decades had essentially been at the bottom of most of India's health indicators. A few years ago, when the NFHS 5 survey came out, it is not an accident that for the first time in some indicators, UP and Bihar actually raised the national average. They're usually used to dragging down the average. Mr. Singh comes from Bihar and knows the state very well. There are winds of change, in many parts of India's poorest states, that is being really triggered by the spread of the DPI infrastructure. So the lessons from what's happening with DPI, the fact that, India's presidency also brought the AU as a permanent member of the G20. So really now it's a G21. The fact that women-led development and a working group on women's empowerment was set up. All of these potentially create channels for future reform that can lead to that more inclusive, sustainable growth that Mr. Kant spoke of. And it is our hope that, as the Gates Foundation, we can continue to be a partner, a catalyst, a supporter of these kinds of conversations. Ultimately, change is going to be driven by countries, by governments, by the shareholders of the IFIs. But as a stakeholder in some of these conversations with a vision to making sure that the world has an equitable, inclusive, prosperous future, particularly for people in the global south, we do look forward to continuing to contribute. So this is going to be a long-term agenda for us, not something that we're going to stop with just this one conversation or this G20 presidency. We look forward to continuing the partnership with ICRIER, with the government of India and global institutions to make sure the threads of what emerged over the last 3 years and what will come out of South Africa next year really sets the stage for a more inclusive, just, and fair world. But particularly one where the potential of the global south can be fully realized to help drive global prosperity and peace for the next decades. Thank you so much.
So I'll request the panelists to take a group picture, but in the meantime, we had slotted for a coffee break, but we are running short. So I'll request the hotel guys to come and serve the coffee on the table. But for you guys to stand up and relax a bit because you have been sitting for too long. And I'll appreciate that, but we'll continue the process if you don't mind, rather than having a 20 minutes, 50 minutes coffee break, which we can't afford. But do please stand up and, relax a little bit before you again have to sit down for the next few minutes. Thank you.
एक अकेले लो यहाँ साथ में।
Okay. We do one thing. We just want the two of us.
You want?
I'll send you one photo, Akele Wala. Parson, I had a photo with Dr. C.
MDB reforms in the fast lane. It will be chaired by Sir Masood Ahmed, President. Sir Masood Ahmed, President Emeritus of Center for Global Development. The panel would include Suma Chakrabarti, former President EBRD, Anil Kishora, Vice President New Development Bank, Vera Songwe, non-resident Senior Fellow Brookings, and Augusta Kwame, Country Director, India World Bank. I would request the panel to join us on the stage.
Responsibility to bring the house in order now.
I don't know if you're leaving.
You're-
Actually, because I'm doing the TFT.
All right.
So
I
it's
think I
20,
have,
And I know you guys are discussing the report. I would
mic
like
is-
to
mic
talk to
is
you
on.
with
I've just been told by
just talk to you
Tanu
about 1 or 2
that
points on that.
my first
Please.
responsibility is
you.
to get people to sit down.
Should I put it in my pocket?
So can I encourage people who are still getting
Okay.
coffee in the back to find a chair? And we have an hour and.
Oh,
an
it's-
hour, I think, right? We have an hour, I think. yeah.
What do we have? When were we supposed to finish? 11:14.
Okay, I see also that our fourth panelist, Anil Kishora, has joined us online. Hello, Anil.
okay, thank you.
Okay,
Hello, good morning.
welcome. I'll come to you in a bit. So the bad news for this panel is that Ajay Seth, who was supposed to be moderating, has been called away. And so I'm stepping in for him. The good news is that you have one less panelist, which means that our remaining panelists will have more time and will have to work harder. So I want us to get started, I think, if we can. And we've already had two very compelling and comprehensive interventions. First by Mr. Singh, then by Mr. Kant. And they have laid out both the imperative to ensure that we move to a positive sum game,
Yes.
where there is global growth, and that we put in place the enablers for global growth. I mean, if you listen to what Amitabh was saying, a lot of it was about how do you put in place the enablers to transition the world to one there is more growth, greener growth, and more inclusion, lifting people out of poverty. And what Mr. Singh was saying is, we think that the multilateral development banks, and we'll come a bit maybe also to the IMF, that these institutions have a key role in providing some of those enablers. Not everything, because the trading system is still going to be an important part, but the MDBs have a key role in providing financing on the right terms, in the right amounts, to the right projects, to be able to help us make that transition happen. And that is why there was this vision that was laid out in the report that NK and Larry Summers co-convened. And I want to take a little parenthesis to just say thank you to Deepak and his team, because really for us working on this was a terrific partnership. So Deepak, thank you again for that. But that report laid out a vision. And so now, 18 months later, we can ask ourselves 3 questions, which I'm hoping the panelists will also address. The first is that vision still right? Do we feel that we should have been saying different things, the triple agenda, the scale of ambition, the mobilization of private capital, having institutions that are more nimble, bolder. Is that still the right vision? Second question is the one that I think, NK, you addressed directly, which is, how are we doing on realizing that vision? And you said it. In a normal world, you would have said, look, over the last year, none of the institutions has moved backwards. They've all made some small progress in different ways, and they'll all point to something. And if you add it all up, it doesn't quite get to being the trajectory that would get us to realize this vision. Which then takes us to the third question. Well, why is this going to change, or are we stuck on this trajectory? What will enable us to transition from the trajectory that we are on, which is used to be that, and now it's a little bit better, but it's nowhere near what it needs to be? Is this the future, or can we make it any different? Or what's holding it up? And I think the issues are not technical. That's very clear from what Amitabh was saying also, that the world is going through big political seismic shifts, and rethinking, reimagining, reworking the multilateral development finance institutions requires some degree of consensus amongst the key shareholders to move us forward. And getting that consensus is very hard today. But also the political economy within the institutions is something you have to shift. These are all institutions that have been here a long time. So what I'm hoping from our panelists today is to get a little bit their take on how they see the bottlenecks right now in moving that agenda forward, and what would be the ways in which you could actually make progress given the world in which we live. And if I have one plea, it is that I think starting from the assumption that the world is better than it is, and then sketching out a grand plan of how things will go well in that world is probably not as useful as recognizing that the world is where we are, and we need to make what progress we can in that world. So no one better to start us off than Suba, who's been inside running a multilateral development bank, outside in the UK government, sort of overseeing the work of multilateral development banks, and now as the chair of ODI, also having an opportunity to think critically on ways in which you can advance your agenda. So Suma, I'm going to come to you first. I'll come to Vera next. And then before I come to you, August, I'd like to come to Anil Kishore, because Anil is in the New Development Bank, of course. And the New Development Bank, the question is it going to break the mold and help to change the system, or is it going to become more and more like the system? That's the question. I'm going to give you advance warning, Anil, for that. So, Suba.
Thank you very much, Masood, for that build-up, and thanks to Deepak for the invitation to speak at this event. So on your three questions, the first, is this the right agenda that was sketched out by the independent experts group? A resounding yes. In my view, the report of a year ago was the best ever statement of what the agenda should be and what we should do to try and achieve that agenda. There have been many, many reports like this, but the work of NK, Larry Summers, and the team that pulled this together in the Indian G20 presidency, and Amitabh's work as Sherpa, I think was fantastic. And I honestly mean that. So we have the right agenda. Your second question was really how are we doing against that? And I don't want to cannibalize the speech I have to give at the Kautilya on this very subject on Sunday, but my quick summary would be very much in line with what NK said earlier. And I may use this phrase that he used, I wrote it down: some successes and huge disappointments as well. And I think that's absolutely correct. If you look at what has happened, I think some progress, certainly on the capital mobilization stuff. You can see some progress there, hybrid capital and so on. But in the other areas, particularly where shareholders have to take a different approach to how these banks are run, managed, and what they do and how they perform, much less progress than we would like to see. And I'll say more about that on Sunday, no doubt. So what explains this? And I think for me, that's your third question. And what can we do about it? Well, first of all, what explains this? Because otherwise we need to understand what to do on the basis of what we think is the analysis of what's the difficulty. And the difficulty for me is these banks, and I'm going to speak like an old man here, so forgive me, but these banks, I think increasingly, and I started my career as a young assistant in the UK office of the World Bank and IMF in 1988. I think since then, the banks have over time become even more captured by the supply side than the demand side. If I look at even ODI's survey of borrowing countries 3 years ago, you can see to what extent the focus of the managements, the leaderships of these banks and what borrowing countries want have diverged quite a bit. We will repeat this survey with ICRIER, ODI and ICRIER next, it's actually going to come out, I think, in the spring. So we'll see whether that gap is being closed. But I think there's now a sort of gap between what is being offered and what is wanted, particularly operationally, I think. And in some subjects as well. So inequality, I would say, jobs, technology, I've mentioned technology, jobs, productivity, all those sorts of areas which are modern areas, particularly for middle income countries, are not being sufficiently tackled, I think, by the MDBs. Well, why is that? Well, what is this? For me, I think a supply side capture that's been going on for the last 30, 40 years is very much in the advanced economies, the countries that actually provide most of the capital for these multilateral development banks, a capture by lobbies in those countries, including my own in the UK, who are focused, often for very good reasons and understandable reasons, on making obstacles even larger to actually borrow, to lending. So some of the environmental and social safeguards are now applied disproportionately almost. A small loan or a large loan, you'd have to go through the same sort of mechanism. This slows everything down completely. It puts silt into the whole works. So the whole ambition of getting from 24 months to 12 months, let's say in the World Bank, is very difficult for the World Bank staff and management to deliver when they're under pressure, frankly, from the lobbies in the advanced countries to keep those standards at that level for every single loan. To actually harmonize procurement even is very difficult to do in that situation because, again, you're under pressure from industrial lobbies in various advanced economies as well. And finance ministries, I think, increasingly have become almost somewhat de-linked from the MDB scene and have become very, very conservative on capital issues. So the whole debate has been, we've made some progress on capital adequacy, but not enough, largely because the finance ministries in those countries are still extremely conservative about that. So this supply side capture has, at the same time, I think, you can see it also in obviously in the shareholding structure of these banks. The voice of emerging markets is not what it should be. Emerging markets today are more than 50% of global GDP in PPP terms, if you look at the population size as well. And yet their voting strength is way below what it should be. We all know this. And geopolitics is part of the difficulty of making change in this. So we're not going to move very quickly on that. But there's also an issue, I think, with the emerging markets, that emerging markets do not come together and speak together in a collective interest quite often. You can see it, for example, in just the leaderships of these banks. Most of them are still led by advanced economies, and the developing countries, emerging markets cannot come together to put forward a single candidate amongst themselves to challenge that. That's just a leadership issue. But on many of these other issues, the G20 doesn't focus enough on implementation. I said this when the report came out. I thought it would be very important to have an implementation focus in the G20 on it. That is one of the things that I think is missing generally. So what can be done? What can we do to try and make the system, as I say, more demand-facing and less supply-side dominated? I think one of the things would be to try and make progress. This is quite technical. Make progress on some things which are actually not in the statutes. For example, the policy work, the country strategy work, this is not set down anywhere that it has to be approved at a certain level by the governors. It's actually just a policy that's been adopted. I think that can be challenged, because if you have country strategies that are more focused on what the demand from developing countries is, then you'd have a better MDB system actually focusing on the right things more often. And here I would say there is some hope. It's not often you'll hear me praise the UN system, but here's one, which is that I think the shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals was a good shift. Now, many would argue there are too many SDGs compared to a few MDGs, but the MDGs was a supply-side dominated Western lobbyist agenda. And when I used to run DFID with Masood, we'd go to countries like Vietnam and they say, well, thank you very much, but we want to talk about growth. Where's the growth agenda in this? As Amitabh says, it's not there. Now, the SDGs are much more full picture of the characteristics of development that you want to see. And that is actually an advance. And it was advanced through the UN system to do that, involving developing countries coming together with advanced economies. So there's some areas where you can make alliances to try and get advances as well. I would say also there's the development committee that exists in the World Bank system, IMF World Bank system, is too passive. And this is a committee where emerging markets have much greater voice. And that's where emerging markets should come together, drive that agenda through the development committee. I've always favored, I made a speech on MDBs assistance back at ODI in 2015, nearly 10 years ago. And I always thought maybe the best way to do this, to use the different business models of the MDBs and actually come up with a system that was more than the sum of its parts, would be to use the development committee more to set the agenda. Because there, the emerging markets have a much greater voice than they do on the boards of the individual institutions as well. On transaction costs, unless emerging markets really continue to harass together the managements and the advanced economy shareholders, this will not move as fast as we want it to do. I would do some work in Central Asia, and this is the biggest bugbear, 24 months to get from concept to disbursement. Well, they can go to a Chinese bank and get that done in 3 months, if not less. And that's what they'll do. So really, this is actually in everyone's interest to try and actually move this forward. And I know World Bank staff, EBRD staff on the ground all feel the same about this, because it's a real pain for them too. That is, I think, something that can be done as well. So I think these are sort of practical things that I think we can do within the world we're living in, a world that is much more protectionist than it used to be, much more economically nationalist, but where I think there are some areas of collective interest where we can actually try and make some progress. So fundamentally, I think it's going to be about leadership, but I think it's going to be about leadership from the emerging markets rather than waiting for Godot, i.e. the advanced economies to come together and suddenly see the light. We are living also, I will say, not just in an economically nationalist age, we're also living in an age where Western leadership, in my view, is increasingly more domestic oriented, less internationalist. So we have to bear that in mind is a further constraint on this.
Thank you very much, Suma. No, I think that central point that you put on the table, we should come back to in the conversation, which is that given the dynamics, the progress is going to come from the people who these institutions were set up to serve, taking more of an active leadership role in defining what they want from them and pushing for those changes. Some of them very practical, some of them could actually then go to levels of organization, leadership, governance, rather than starting from a conversation being primarily about let's change shareholding and voting rights, which gets very quickly stuck. Might as well start with the things that are going to make a difference. So, Veera, of course, you also, I think everybody on this panel has both been inside one of these institutions, with the exception, I think I'll come to Anil, but this is the first time. But Veera, you were inside the institution a long time ago. Then you went off to work in the UN system. Now you've been part of the panel, as NK said, that put together this report. From where you sit, what's your take on the three questions that I laid out, and also on Suma's proposals?
No, thank you. And let me start by thanking ICRIER and Deepak for all the work that we did together. And of course, NK and Larry for the report. The India G20, I think it's the first time I see the data, but it is clear that it was an amazing run that the India G20 put together. And today I'm working with Brazil on the TF Clima report, which is the climate and finance for the Brazil G20. In some sense, a continuation of this, and hopefully we are carrying some of the recommendations from the India MDB report. I think there've been 2 or 3 shifts in some sense in the world that the report was very, very clear about, and NK talked about as well. We talked about bigger, better, and bolder. And bolder was also to say, let's work with the private sector. And today I created an institution in the private sector to leverage capital and hopefully close the yields and the cost of capital for emerging markets. And I think that's an area where we can do a lot more with the MDBs. And it's an area that is less beholden to sort of shareholder decisions. And so if I talk about, say, for example, the IFC, we have in the IFC, and I used to be the regional director in the IFC. At the time, what we used to do was originate and hold. So we created the projects, we developed the projects, and we held them. And we never sort of brought in the private sector. We didn't have enough of the instruments for the private sector to come in. And I think one of the strong reports, recommendations of the report was originate to distribute. And which essentially means we develop the projects and then we sort of put it back into the hands of the private sector where they can do it better. We haven't done well at that yet. And one, we complain that there is a lack of project pipeline. But the whole point of the World Bank on the other side of the World Bank IFC relationship is that the World Bank should help develop the projects. And I think there's been a lot of conversation on de-risking. Let's go find some risk capital here and risk capital there. But the risk capital is the World Bank. The World Bank is there to sort of do the policy reforms, make sure that, you know, you get your land permit rights, your transportation right, you know, that you can actually get whatever it is that you're importing into the country on time to your site. And then I think that one of the recommendations in the report was getting these institutions to work better together. First, just if I talk about the World Bank and the IFC, but about the World Bank, the IFC, the EBRD, the Asian Development Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, how we can spread our balance sheets together, for example, to work and use our guarantees much faster. So today what you will see, and I think it's, I don't know if it's a frustration for you here, but because our guarantees are limited in each of these institutions, even if you have a very good project, if you've run out of guarantees for that fiscal year, the country has to wait 1 year for the next fiscal year to kick in for the right institution to avail the right guarantee to you. And I think one of the things that is very, very underappreciated is the cost of waiting. The cost of waiting is incredibly expensive. And so if you wait 2 years and then you get de-risking of 3%, I'm sorry, you've waited 12%. And so if you de-risk me at 3% and I've waited 12%, I still have 9% of expensive cost. And I don't think that we're putting those numbers into actuality. And my sense is some of the MDB work and some of the frustration that we're seeing is because in the bolder, we needed to work more with the private sector. But to become better, we need the kind of staff that will understand and speak the private sector's language. And so often, you know, when we're in a room together, private sector, now I consider myself on the private sector side, you know, you're talking about swaps and why is the IMF not being able to put together a swap line. Half of the people don't even understand what is the importance of that swap line. But if you look at least the African countries, 54 of them went to China a few weeks ago. What was one of the 2 big things that they did? They opened swap lines with China. the IMF should be doing this. And I think it's a huge gap in first of all, the conversation that we're having with the multilateral institutions. Can they migrate? And there still is a sense in a lot of the MDBs that the profit-making motive of the private sector is bad. And so there's always this sense of, should I help you, the private sector, because you're going to make a profit? But no, the private sector has to make a profit for the system to stand, for jobs to be created, for development to happen, and for growth to persist and be sustained. And I think that contradiction between the fear, threat, and suspicion of the private sector and sort of then really making sure that you can get a private sector that grows and that you can lend the instruments that are needed for it is something that we are missing. But my sense is that because the private sector today is a global private sector, we have an ally in the MDB in that private sector. And just a few weeks ago, I was in a room with, the best of the private sector. Now Mark Carney is on the other side, and Larry Fink and all these people, and they're talking about de-risking and first loss and guarantees provided by the MDBs. And they are from shareholder countries. And I think their voice can be a very strong voice in helping us push the conversation a little bit more. Because as countries, developing emerging market countries, our voice is not strong. But when Larry Fink shows up in the room, I mean, the man is managing $32 trillion of capital, even the US Treasury stands up. And so I think that if we were able, as the MDB system, and the report says that very clearly, and we haven't done it enough, is how can we use the private sector of the West to help push, some of the conversations that we're having. And for me, I think the interest that the private sector has now, especially, and I want to come to the climate, we're getting them in the room on climate. We're getting all of the big guys in the room to say, again, Mark Carney and Altera and the UAE with the 35 billion. How has the World Bank, the IEB, the Inter-American Development Bank, Altera has put $35 billion out on the table to say, I want to put these resources to the risk for climate. The MDBs have not come together and said to Altera, let's see how we can work with you. We're waiting, we're working, we're thinking, and I think there is still a shyness from the MDBs to approach the private sector. The system is not yet fit for purpose. And this is okay, because 80 years ago when Bretton Woods was created, we didn't have that kind of MDB system. And finally, something that we talked about in the report, but not enough, and is emerging, and maybe because of the Brazil G20, is the importance of national development banks. National development banks as another de-risking tool, because we focused a lot on de-risking capital, but the World Bank is the first de-risking institution and is not doing enough of the de-risking for the IFC and the rest of the private sector. National development banks are an important de-risking agency. They are there to do the initial growth, do the scoping, do the project development. They can take that first loss. They have long-term capital. They have local currency, so you don't have the FX risk in the most difficult part of the investment that you're about to make. And I think working with them, but also going one step further and saying, can we offer guarantees? Today, we do not offer guarantees to local conglomerates. We only give guarantees to a firm that comes from outside. So, I mean, India, take any one of your big industries, the Mahindra, Tata, they cannot get a guarantee to invest in India. Because the system was created to bring Western investment into the developed world or into the developing world. But now if the developing world is going to be the motor of growth, we have to help them in that geography develop even better and even stronger. And so I think changing some of the instruments in the MDBs so that, a Tata or a Mahindra or a Tano industry in Cote d'Ivoire can actually invest in that toll road, in that buildings, in the green housing is going to be something that we need to do more and better. So there is hope. I end with saying the report remains critical. We haven't, I think we are at 42% of reaching the 32 indicators that we put in the report. I think the bright spot about it is that now it's very clear what needs to be done. We cannot hide behind shareholders, but we can use the private sector from our shareholder countries because they are engaged, they are interested. If the growth is coming from the emerging markets, that private sector sees its future in those markets. And so they are talking to their shareholders, they're talking to the US Treasury, to the French Treasury, to the German Treasury, and saying, we need to go to India, we need to go to Cameroon, we need to go to Ivory Coast, and we do need to use them to make sure that we can change the system.
Yeah. Good.
Thanks very much, Vera.
Good.
No, I
Thank
think
you.
so. Suba said, we really need to get the emerging markets, borrowing countries, to play a much more active, proactive leadership role. Vera's now added on to that the private sector in rich countries as another source, potential motor for pushing the agenda forward, because we haven't really done very well on private capital mobilization. We come back to that. I do worry a little bit about virtue signaling here, because a lot of the private sector conversations that you hear are basically ways of saying we want to do good things, but it's these MDBs that are the problem that are holding us up. But let's explore that. And I think the other point that you made, which is really important, is the cost of waiting and the cost of capital. I mean, if you think about it, the green transition is essentially swapping a stream of payments for fossil fuels with upfront capital payments for equipment. It's basically, that's the essence of the green transition, right? Almost no technology of the green transition doesn't involve swapping a stream of payments over time for fuel that you buy with upfront payments to set up the machinery that enables you to avoid buying those fuel. And therefore, by definition, it is much more sensitive to the cost of capital. It's a capital-based system. And therefore, if you have to end up paying 400, 600 basis points more for the same capital, then it's going to be much less profitable to set it up in those countries. And that's why bringing down the cost of capital becomes a central feature of success or failure on achieving the objectives of the green transition. So I think that's a really important point that you made. Anil, I'm going to come to you if I may now. Welcome. And I want you to say, Suba said that if you had more borrower-based, emerging market-based thinking in an institution, then they would act differently. And of course, you are now in an institution where the governance is very much, the shareholding is very much a borrower-based, emerging market-based governance. So what's your take on these points that have been made so far and your perspective on it?
Thank you, Masood. Honored to be part of this panel. Very important points made by Suma and yourself and Vera. Give me a few minutes to kind of whatever has been done so far by the MDBs, probably it's time to take note of that as well, and a lot has been done.
Right.
Let me begin by making 2 points for context. A, this is the first time MDBs are attempting to execute on such a comprehensive and ambitious reforms agenda. It has not happened before. And as Vera brought it out in multiple ways, I think the operating model and business processes of almost all MDBs, including to an extent, the new generation MDBs, which includes NDB, continues to be largely of 1946 and 66 vintage, when path-breaking institutions like the World Bank or ADB were created. This creates a situation where MDBs have to deliver on the reforms and to do so, simultaneously recalibrate existing approaches and develop new toolkits, templates, processes for a better, bigger, and more effective system. We don't have that. No denying this handicaps speedy results, but MDBs have certainly adopted an all-hands-on-deck approach. When this independent experts group report came in last year, NDB was heading the group of heads of MDBs, and we came up with a joint statement. And since then, I find that it has been an all hands on deck approach. Sometimes you might find that execution is very slow. It's because of the complexities involved. Let me cite, last week only I could interact with the James Secretariat, and I found that making data public may sound very simple, but it required a really huge amount of preparatory work. And it is still ongoing, and they are on track to announce it in 2024. Likewise, engagement with rating agencies. We used to hold biannual collective meets. We held 3 so far with rating agencies. It wasn't optimal at all. Now, MDBs have set up a global risk and finance forum comprising all the CROs and CFOs of major MDBs to work on and evolve joint approaches to key issues. This is something new. So a lot has happened. It may not be reflecting immediately externally. Now, in terms of NDB, that we follow country system has proved to be our forte. And we recently carried out an assessment in a few of our member countries and found that country systems have evolved and now become robust enough to deliver good outcomes. We don't need exclusive separate standards. We can follow the country systems without any difficulty. Now we need to spread this, and precisely the point that we need to do some global south kind of thinking and developing world to strengthen the demand side and not be a captive of the supply side issues. We are taking steps to bring together relevant staff from major MDBs early, maybe possibly early next year, to do some deep dive on country systems and reflect on the way forward. And I think that as NDB adds new members, country systems will become a standard ask. All member countries are going to ask for it, and then there will be a momentum behind it. Another point to note regarding, since we are talking about NDB, NDB, as you said, is managed by borrowing countries from the global south. The majority shareholding is with us. In some quarters, there was an apprehension that the inherent agency risk will dent its governance. It has not happened. NDB's board has ensured that the bank is run along sound banking principles. In my view, and I sounded a few of my colleagues, it's time NDB shareholders start thinking about NDB 2.0 to shape it as a game changer. In the beginning, it was important that we set up the bank and roll it out. But now that it has happened, it's really time for NDB 2.0 to realize the ambitions which the founders probably had when they envisaged setting up a new bank. When I was talking about this private sector, let me quickly move on to this private capital issue. It is certainly the most challenging. And frankly, we need to develop new tools. We don't have the tools. We don't have the mechanisms. World Bank's Private Sector Innovation Lab, to my mind, is a big move to garner ideas and insights. I had a chance, along with some other colleagues, to participate in a recent meeting of the lab. Hopefully, more MDBs will follow suit and open windows to let new ideas in. This is really, really critical to open our windows to the external world. We talked about trillions for climate and SDGs. Let's remember that investments need to make economic sense for investors to jump in. Cryptos and NFTs are popular asset classes. There is no reason why infrastructure sustainable development can't find takers. But still, this has been challenging. One reason, to my mind, again, is that the operating model and what Ajay Banga calls internal plumbing within MDBs are quite different. Perhaps MDBs need to explore options as partnerships, as staff secondments from the private sector, or even as special vehicles to fully realize the ambitions. We need to find ways and means to deepen linkages with the private players. This is an area which probably merits a deeper dive during the next G20 presidency. Just to sum up, as I said, the good work that has been done, IEG recommendations have certainly gathered pace. This is the first time that all MDBs are engaged in a lot of heavy lifting. Operating as a system has become the new normal. However, earlier, Suma was talking about the reforms in terms of, yes, shareholding, etc., down the line at some point in time, and there are things that can be done. But deeper MDB reforms will require sustained efforts on at least a few fronts. And those have been hinted at, mentioned in the IEG report as well. First, getting the plumbing right, some sort of business process re-engineering, if you like. It really takes a lot of time, or approaches were suitable for a certain era. Probably we need to change that. Second, coming up with the right set of metrics to alter the incentive structures. That is really critical. The incentive structures probably, as the earlier panelists were mentioning, were designed at a time when it was a donor-donee kind of a model, or it was a different world altogether. Finally, refreshing the existing governance models to the extent feasible. In my view, for example, it might be an idea worth experimenting to induct independent experts or eminent personalities into MDB's boards, maybe with no voting rights. I believe external parties who have had experience in running MDBs or outside the MDB world and have a holistic picture will help us break from the traditional ways of doing things, which we really need to do. There could be other approaches to refresh governance, and probably that's where some more reflections are required. Let me pause here.
Thank you very much. And those are all really important points. And I want to pick up, and I'll come to August next, the point that you made about country systems progressively becoming the norm, and how can one push towards that, and where, and I think this other point also that you made about the plumbing, getting that right. And August, so you've been listening to all these ideas, you've seen the reports, everyone's got plans for what you and your team should be doing differently. Everyone's got an idea. And so my question to you is, you and your colleagues who are also sitting there are responsible for helping one of the most important partners, clients of the World Bank to design, deliver a set of programs. And how much is this big discussion about MDB reform, the triple agenda, how much of that is filtering through into what you all do? I mean, are you like, okay, this is good stuff in Washington, let me get on with it, but I've got a life and I have to do my stuff, I have a deliverables, I've got targets to meet? Or is this, because, and the second part of this that I want to get your view also is this plumbing discussion. If you're in a building in London, say, old building, you have a flat there, and the central hot water. Sometimes, it takes a time before the hot water actually comes to your tap, because it has to work its way through all the pipes in the building,
Sounds like personal experience.
In London.
So my question to you is, you're the tap end of this, right? You're the front end. So Ajay Banga is saying, we'll reform the plumbing, and maybe there's boilers are being rechanged somewhere, and it's all going to get more efficient. But is the hot water coming through any faster to you? I mean, do you feel anything different here?
Yeah.
So I want to get a little bit your take on all of this.
Thanks, Thank you. Thank you very much, Masood. These are very exciting questions, but first let me thank, again, Dr. Singh for your very powerful point you made earlier, especially on the role of the shareholders, and I'll come to it, Masood, in a minute, talking about your question. I also like to thank Amitabh. I think Amitabh was really a champion of what we're discussing today. And, I remember the emotional moment when he orchestrated the entrance or the admission of the African Union in the G20. And that goes back to your first question, whether the vision we're discussing is still valid. Yes, it is valid, because that vision is a vision of a world that is very inclusive, where everybody has a voice. And Deepak, thank you also so much for being a champion of this conversation here in India. And I think India's G20 will live on. I call it a 1 in 20-year event, but it will be, India's G20 will be a 20-year action plan. I think we will be working on this agenda until India has the G20 presidency again. So you've laid out, a big work program for us here, and many thanks to this panel. It's really an honor to be part of this, and I've been listening very carefully. I think this whole thing started almost in the same place where we were in 1944. We were in a world in crisis, and we are today in a world in crisis, the poly crisis, multiple crises. And when it hit us, the world said, you need to strengthen your capital adequacy so that you can respond to this crisis. You can't, your capital is good for business as usual. It's not good enough for crisis to respond to crisis. So you need to have some kind of buffer to respond to crisis. And we listened. And then they also said, your system is actually very old. You need to evolve it. And then we came up with this evolution roadmap, which NK mentioned earlier. And really, thanks to India's G20 for the IIG report, which gave us even more impetus to transform ourselves. And maybe if the IIG report had come before the evolution roadmap, we'll have called our evolution roadmap the revolution roadmap. Because we're evolving, we're still evolving, but we need to really, it cannot be business as usual, and it cannot be marginal transformation. So the vision was right, but maybe I'll conclude later by saying, the vision perhaps needs to change for the reasons that we're discussing now. And on your second question, which your second question of the first three, how are we doing? I think we're doing pretty well, given the framework and the mandate that was given to us in the evolution roadmap and in the IIG report. I think our scorecard on implementation is quite impressive, I would think, but it is not sufficient at all, because the vision itself perhaps was it was not ambitious enough. But what we've done in the past 2 years is, in my view, something that the world has not taken notice of. NK mentioned Larry's summary. He was here, and we had a very good conversation 2 nights ago, and he told me a lot of the things you're telling me, we don't know. So let me share a few things with you on what, how we have been implementing these IIG recommendations and the evolution roadmap. First, we've increased IBRD's capacity to lend by 50%, just by changing things internally. We have reduced the equity to loan ratio. We have introduced hybrid capital. We have introduced portfolio guarantee. These 3 things together allow us to increase how much IBRD can lend by 50%. This is not insignificant. If you can do that without a capital increase, wow, this is to me, this is amazing. And we've done that by maintaining our AAA rating, which is a global public good, because if we have it, then other MDBs will have it. If we drop it, probably it will have to be dropped for other MDBs as well. And the AAA rating is a public good because it allows the borrowers to borrow from us at lower interest rate. We have also improved our efficiency. We're not at 12 months yet for loan preparation to identification to approval, but we're getting there. Our president, Ajay Banga, he likes saying, development delayed is development denied. And I should add that whenever you deny development to someone, you actually, missing the whole mandate that the world gave you as an MDB, because our role is development precisely. So we have changed our internal system to move faster. We now can, instead of doing 2 review meetings before a project is approved, we can just do 1 if the project is not a high risk. These are internal cuisine, the plumbing that you're talking about, but we're seeing it, we feel it. As a country director, I can now approve additional financing to a project if the project is doing well. That never happened to the bank before in the past 80 years. It had, in the past, you have to go back to Washington to add money to a project that is doing well. And all these are coming from the notion that Ajay is saying, if things are going, you have the authority to do even better things, to do more. We now don't need to go back to our board for certain projects. We call them MPAs. If you're adding a project to a package that has already been approved by the board and it's very similar to what the board approved, the vice president can approve that. You don't need to go to the board. These things will make us work faster. And on the disbursement side, we can also work faster. So we're doing a lot of things. And then on the private sector financing side and private capital mobilization, it was mentioned several times, the private sector innovation lab. I think this is the first time we are opening ourselves to criticism from the private sector guys who know how to do the work. They're telling us, if you really want to mobilize private capital, you can't work the way you worked before. And we're listening to them. We've changed our guarantee mechanism. We've created a guarantee platform so that we can tap MIGA's expertise in guarantee and insurance to improve the whole system in the World Bank, in the World Bank Group, I should say. And we have opened MIGA to other MDBs. Other MDBs can now use MIGA to do their work, so that they don't have to create yet another MIGA internally. And then we have introduced what we call, a corporate scorecard, but probably the name may change in the future because we used to have 120 so indicators to measure how we do. And now we only have 20, we have reduced it to 22. And for the first time, it is a scorecard that is used across the World Bank Group. IBRD, IDA, MIGA, IFC, we all have to use the same corporate scorecard. And one key indicator in it is private capital mobilization, and there are many others indicators. And then I think perhaps it will change someday because I would love to see that corporate scorecard be used by all MDBs. Then we have the same system. Then we're all measured by the same result. And then we can have conversations on how we're doing and how we can work together to achieve what we want to achieve. I should also say that, and perhaps I should have started with that, on the vision, we embrace the vision that you laid out earlier and that NK laid out earlier. We embraced it so much that it has actually become part of our own vision and mission, right? I call it the PPP, the triple P. We used to have 2 Ps. We used to have poverty and prosperity. Now we've added planet. So we are the PPP bank. We're the triple P. And then you can see that in the corporate scorecard, actually. We have 5 pillars, and 3 of them are those 3 Ps: poverty, prosperity, and planet. And then we've added infrastructure and digital development and some cross-cutting areas. And now our mission is clearly stated now. It's to eliminate poverty and boost shared prosperity on a livable planet. And this was also introduced as part of the evolution roadmap under Ajay's leadership and in reflecting the IAG's call for the triple agenda. So we've done quite a lot. How are we feeling this plumbing and whether it is percolating the discussion in the work we do here? I'll merge that with your last question on, are we stuck on this trajectory? So we feel it. We feel this change. Maybe we don't feel it enough. Because as you know, Masood, there are thousands of miles between Washington, D.C. and Delhi. And this matters. It matters because a lot of the discussions we're having are geared toward how we want to improve our systems in the future. But what we do today is embedded into procedures, processes, policies that are valid now, and they haven't been changed yet. So when I say, okay, I want to move to 12 months project approval, well, somebody will tell me, well, if your project is not low risk, you have to do 24, you have to use the 24 months. And then I said, well, do I reduce the risk by ignoring the risk, or do I work with the client to reduce the risk? That Washington will say, well, you do what you want, but you can't do the 12 months. You reduce your project progression. So we feel the plumbing, we feel the water percolating, but it is, instead of being very hot, coming very hot, it come cold, and then it come warm, and then we're waiting for the really hot water to arrive here. So we're lucky here in India because we have strong country systems, and we're using a lot of, and the team is here, I should really praise the team, we're using a lot of innovation and creativity to do certain things whilst we're flying the plane. So we're fixing it whilst flying it. So if Secretary Seth was here, he would have told you, here in India, we're working already very closely with ADB. So the partnership that was embedded in the Triple Agenda, we're implementing it here. We're preparing 3 or 4 projects jointly with ADB as co-financing. We have joint mission as we speak. We have a 53-person mission here in India, joint IBRD, IFC, MIGA, and ADB mission here, the first time, at least in my 2 years here, that we've had that mission on urban water and sanitation. And we are also scaling up our financing here in India. We're tapping already in the 50% IBRD increase I mentioned earlier. So hopefully this year we'll do a lot, we'll finance a lot more. We're scaling up IFC. We have our managing director for the IFC here. He arrived here last night, and this is his second visit in 2 years because we want to do more in IFC, with IFC. Makta is here, yes. And MIGA, for the first time, last fiscal year had its first 2 guarantees here. So the originate to distribute, we've done it with between IBRD and MIGA with SBI, right? We did that even before it became policy in the bank. So we're implementing a lot of these things, Masood, in India because we're lucky to have a strong country system. We're lucky to have a strong country, a strong client, and we like calling India actually the lighthouse or the sandbox in how we're implementing the evolution roadmap. So a lot of the things that you'll see in the future are already happening in India. I should close by trying to answer maybe your some aspect of your last question. I think we're a little bit, I'm a bit underwhelmed by the progress that we've made. And I find perhaps even the vision a bit underwhelming. Why? Because we are assuming that the MDB structure and architecture we have now is the right one, and we need to fix it to improve on it. I'm not sure it's the right one. And here I'm speaking in my personal behalf. I do think that the drive that we had as a global community in the 40s to create a solution to the crisis we had has fizzled out. And today what we're doing is we don't have the same drive. We have a divided world. And the MDB architecture we have now reflect the fact that the world is divided. And you can't go and win a war with a divided army, right? And why is the world, I think our MDB reflect the divided world? Well, we have the World Bank, and then I won't mention all of them, but just let's go back to what Anil said. NDB is a new bank. If you look at NDB's ambition, NDB could potentially become like the World Bank. Why not? MDB should want to be like the World Bank. If I were them, I'll want to be like the World Bank. I will expand my membership beyond the BRICS, bring in more countries, increasingly more, have a strong capital. If I were the AIIB, I would want to be like the World Bank, right? And EBRD has membership now and projects beyond Europe. In my view, we have several World Banks in the making. Some will say it's good, competition is good. I will think economies of scale, economies of scope is good if you really want to use your capital to create efficiency in a sector, in a market that is essentially a public good. sector. It's not a private sector. We're not talking about private capital. We're talking about public capital toward development. So there is a public good and externality element. So we need to think about what is the optimal structure of the MDB system. And that will require that the world comes together and think about it together. And I don't know how this will be done. And I'll give up, because I think in the meantime, we have to do with what we have. And we're doing great with what we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, August. So I think you've given us a very nice and positive. I mean, there are things happening. I think Anil made the same point as well. As you said, the IBRD now has the capacity to lend 50% more. But if I understand correctly, actually delivering on that would require shareholders putting money into the hybrid capital and guarantees to some extent as well.
Correct.
Which they haven't yet come forward and done. So you've said you've got a bigger vessel, but now we need the shareholders to step up, as you say, and do their bit to make that happen. And of course, 50% more is not 300%, which is the vision that we were starting from. I'm looking at Deepak and I think Deepak's hand suggests we've got 5 minutes to wrap up. Ananta is here as well. Ananta is here. Welcome for the next session. I don't think we have a lot. 5 minutes, we're not going to get time for stuff from the audience. But I would like is actually to see if any of our panelists have anything they want to react to from what they've heard from the other panelists. So Siba, anything that you want to say, having listened to the others?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to hear actually both from Anil and from Auguste, because they have two banks which have quite different models, actually. I mean, one is obviously has a shareholding which is dominated by emerging markets, and one is not. That's one thing. But also that one operates at country level with country offices and one doesn't. And I would actually quite like to see a comparison between the two in terms of project preparation time and ability to get things done to market. One of EBRD's strengths, actually, was it was much more risk-taking than the other banks. So in 5 years of operating in North Africa, as you said, it moved its geographical thing. It ended up with a bigger portfolio than IFC had in 50 years there. Now, why is that? And it isn't because EBRD had better people. I mean, IFC has great people. It was a risk-taking capacity of the business model of EBRD compared to. So again, I think I think the system issue is a big issue because of different business models, and that is why EBRD I think has been invited now to come to sub-Saharan Africa as well. So I think there is something there that we actually ought to think about more. How can we make the most of this different business models as part of the system?
Right.
And that's probably something for the future that we should work on as well.
Especially because in the case of EBRD, it's not as if the shareholding structure was dominated by borrowers. It was just a different subset.
Yeah.
And somehow that still generated a more risk-tolerant structure.
And I mean, this is, and I think it is instructive that it took the Arab Spring to get EBRD in. It was a geopolitical moment that got EBRD into North Africa. It took me 10 years of hard labor to get EBRD into sub-Saharan Africa. I first proposed it in 2014. Shareholders didn't like it, actually, and it finally went through in 2022.
Yeah.
So that just shows, sometimes the geopolitical moment helps you, and sometimes it's a bloody hard slog because people can't quite see what's in front of them.
Yeah.
And yet it was the same business model.
Vera, any thoughts?
No, and maybe just to follow up, and Amitabh has left, but he mentioned the SDRs. I'm going back to the IMF and I think that we're observing, and India is a clear case in point. I mean, the fierceness of the climate battle is upon us. And we've spent 2 years discussing with the IMF whether we're on lending SDRs, whether we're not. And I really believe that the issuance of new climate SDRs is probably our only way out. I think if there is one crisis we know is going to happen is the climate crisis. If there is one crisis we know how to fix is the climate crisis. And we have in the Articles of Agreement of the IMF an instrument to help us fight crises.
Yeah.
And why we are turning around for 2.5 years discussing the instrument, for me, is mind-boggling. And I really believe that, the more we discuss it, the more expensive it becomes for us to fight the climate crisis. If we issued let's say we issued another 650 billion of SDRs, you take 100 billion of that, you put into guarantees, we will do exactly what you said. Stop the past and start the new. Now we're talking about it and everybody is announcing, oh, I just did a 2 billion guarantee. Oh, we've given the World Bank another 15 billion. I think part of the problem that we have today is just we've gotten so used to underperformance in announcements, and everybody just announces, it's not going to change the climate crisis. And there's no growth that's going to happen. So my sense is, articles of agreement say when there's a crisis, issue SDRs. We have issued SDRs for Western crises. Financial crises, if we want, even maybe the climate crisis is a Western-induced crisis.
Yes.
Because it's a developed country crisis.
Yes.
And I really believe that the India G20 started this discussion. Larry started it, and the Brazilians are pushing it. And maybe one big thing that we should do is just push to get this
SDRs allocated
out of the way.
I think that's a very concrete suggestion, proposal that you've just come back to. 2 years later, the big plan for the last 2 years on SDR reallocation was that you were going to take some and put them into MDBs, and then the MDBs would use that as quasi-capital and leverage it and lend more money. That was the sort of big recycling initiative. Today, zero.
And why that?
Basically, because everybody along the chain has put in something to stop things from moving forward. The lawyers in the system were all against it. Central bankers against it. This is not what SDRs were about. IMF was initially not enthusiastic about it. Just a polite way of saying it's against it. And I think even the MDBs initially were not enthusiastic about it. The World Bank was very slow in picking up on that idea because they thought it was going to compete with IDA money. And so one reason or the other, here we are, all the technical hurdles of one after the other being cleared, there's no money in there. So I think it's a question of our definition of the problem is at that scale, and all our solutions are at this scale. And there's a disconnect on scale, I think, that you've just pointed out. Anil, any final thought?
Yeah, Masood, thank you. Just to mention one quick point here. The greatest outcome of this triple agenda report, to my mind, has been this greater opening up by the MDBs. I have not seen MDBs working so closely together. And all of them are willing to open their windows and doors for new ideas to come in, for others to copy, like World Bank has opened up its NIGA platform, private sector lab, and there is so much communication between all of us. And on a lighter note, this MDBs love to do peer benchmarking. And as a result, we have been kind of becoming clones earlier. But now that new ideas are coming in, and I'm sure we'll copy that too, and the system as a whole will evolve towards the vision laid out in the triple agenda report. Thank you.
Thank you so much. August.
Very, very quickly, Masood, one point I wanted to make is on capital increase. I know as we move toward Rio and we talk about the governance and the voice agenda, it will come up. And it's going to be a very difficult one because of the geopolitics. I mean, we love capital increase at the World Bank, and we need it very badly if we want to meet the triple agenda goal. But I'm not sure it's going to happen because of the geopolitics. You can't increase the proportional share of one member without increasing the others. Right. If you want to increase everybody's shares proportionally, it becomes an issue also. And so I'm wondering whether, whilst we try for a capital increase, which we should continue doing, whether we could not think of a pooling of capital, a mechanism where we pool MDB's capital, where if there is an excess capital in one MDB, call it AIB or NDB, and the World Bank needs more capital to lend, if we could agree on the same sort of corporate scorecard or indicators or KPI, could we have a system in the spirit of collaboration that Anil mentioned, where the World Bank will say, okay, I could use some of the NDBs,
Right.
AIBs excess capital for loans financed by the World Bank, provided they meet the following criteria, and that loan will not count against the World Bank balance sheet, but it will count against the excess capital that ADB or AIB have. And they will define what the excess capital is so that they also have enough space to do their own work. That could, help use the scales and the scope economies that I mentioned earlier, until we have another huge capital increase in the World Bank, which I think may happen, but it may not happen
in time.
Yeah,
That's a good idea. I want to hear the ADB and AIIB representatives making the same proposal. But until that time, it's a good one to keep in mind, because it is thinking of it as a system. That's the point that you make. Great. Well, thank you all very much, the panelists, and thank you all for listening. So let's try this.
Thank you.
Oui, Martha est ici, hein. Je vais lui dire que tu es là, en fait.
I will dire que je suis là.
Oui, je vais lui passer ton numéro de téléphone. Ouais.
We should get Anil in the picture background.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. On to the next panel, I think.
Qu'est-ce que c'est qui
Well
est
done.
dans ma poche? C'était ça.
Oui, c'est ça, c'est un peu encombrant.
I forgot that I had it.
Hey, Anil. How are you
Oh,
doing?
sorry.
All right. Good to see you. Everything well? Yeah. Good. Yeah. Okay, yes. You see that? Yeah, definitely. No, you didn't.
So without further ado, let me introduce you to the second panel. The topic of the panel is financial inclusion through digital public infrastructure-led innovation. The chair of the panel will be Dr. V. Ananta Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor, Ministry of Finance, Government of India. The panel in no order will consist of Chanchal Sarkar, Co-Chair, GPFI Working Group, Ministry of Finance, India, Dilip Asbe, MD and CEO of National Payments Corporation of India, Mahal Dimachki, Head of Innovation Hub Singapore Center BIS, and Nontobeko Lubisi, Director Financial Inclusion, National Treasury, South Africa. Ms. Dimachki and Ms. Lubisi will join us online. We are pleased to have such a distinguished panel and chair join us today. Over to you, sir.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hi. So we are, as I can see in my phone, we are about 11 minutes late, and Deepak has told me that I have a hard stop at 1:30. So we are going to all speak in 2x speed as per YouTube, and also going to request my panelists, those who are present virtually and those who are present here, to keep their remarks crisp so that we squeeze in a few minutes for the audience also to ask a few questions. So last year, basically, the extensive work done under the G20 Indian presidency, digital public infrastructure has globally been recognized as an infrastructure-based approach that uses technology to achieve societal goals through an ecosystem comprising technology, markets, and governance, built in the public interest, that leverages competitive private innovation, but within regulatory guardrails, major achievements were made both under the Sherpa track, digital economy ministers meet, finance tracks, global partnership in financial inclusion, GPFI, etc. Today, DPI is a well-known enabler, fast tracker of financial inclusion, recognized in the G20 and beyond. This year, under the Brazilian presidency, G20 presidency, the work has further advanced on leveraging DPI to take forward financial inclusion to the last mile. On the road to Rio summit, DPI remains as an important focus area in G20. And of course, the upcoming G20 South African presidency can provide even further impetus to help countries, particularly those of the Global South, to exercise the full potential of DPI. So today we have gathered under the aegis of ICRIER's 15th annual International G20 conference to discuss how DPIs can address the persistent last mile challenge in financial inclusion. So we have Mr. Chanchal Sarkar, the GPFI Working Group Co-Chair and Advisor in the Ministry of Finance, Government of India. He spearheaded the DPI and financial inclusion agenda under the Indian G20 presidency. And we have with me on my right, the MD and CEO of National Payments Corporation, Mr. Dilip Asbe. He has had a very pivotal role in designing, building, operationalizing, and managing the large-scale innovative payment processing platform like the UPI, Unified Payment Interface, and Bharat Interface for Money, Immediate Payment Service, IMS, etc., and India's homegrown credit card network, RuPay. In the virtual presence, we have the head of the Innovation Hub Singapore Center of the BIS, Ms. Mahal Dimarki. She is well known for extensive experience in payments infrastructure. She has headed the UK Financial Conduct Authority Payment Department and served as the Chief Payments Officer of Pay.UK. And also we have the Director of Financial Inclusion, National Treasury of South Africa, and GPFI lead from South Africa, Ms. Lubisi, who has been instrumental in endorsement of South Africa's financial inclusion policy framework through her leadership in the development of the National Financial Inclusion Strategy and a monitoring and evaluation framework for financial inclusion. So basically, we have the four panelists, and they will each speak for about maximum 6 to 7 minutes. So I will invite them to give their opening remarks. I'll first start with the two panelists on our screen rather than those who are physically present here. And then we will come to those who are physically present here. So please do stick to the time limit of 7 minutes. And over to, I'm going to start with Ms. Mahal Dimarki for her initial remarks, followed by Ms. Lubisi, and then I'll come to Mr. Asbe, followed by Mr. Chanchal Sarkar. And that is the order of speech. So please, over to you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me, and thank you so much for inviting me to be on this panel. I wish I was there in person with you all, but hopefully the screen will be just as good. So I mean, a great topic to talk to, a vast topic to talk to. So I'll try to limit my time to the 6 to 7 minutes. And I think in the opening remarks, we heard about sort of the digital economy. The digital economy is upon us, and it's a great opportunity to leverage, technologies for the benefit of society. And what better set of examples than actually looking at how do we build digital public infrastructure, harnessing these technologies. And so many countries, as you all know, have already embarked on this journey and started to see the benefits or already reaping the benefits. And India is a great example, right? But let's not forget that it's not new. In financial services in particular, I think we've seen examples in digital public infrastructure in financial markets, such as payment systems, from whether it's real-time gross settlement systems in various countries that have had, tremendous benefit in the kind of clearing and settlement of transactions, to faster payments now, and now we're seeing more technologies coming in, and the use of those technologies being embraced around sort of blockchain and artificial intelligence. And so payment market infrastructure is probably one I want to hone in on a little bit. It's one of these key enablers of financial inclusion. I think, the panel is talking to the question of financial inclusion. And so, in one of the in the earlier joint papers, and I probably should, I don't know if the audience knows much about what the BIS does. The BIS Innovation Hub looks at experimenting with new technologies in partnership with central banks to enhance the financial system. And so financial market infrastructure is one of our key themes. But part of the BIS, being around for 90 years and being kind of a platform for collaboration, of central banks around the world, we also have some standard setting bodies, such as the Committee for Payment Market Infrastructure and the Financial Stability Board. Now, one of the earlier joint papers between the CPMI and the World Bank has recognized that payments is the gateway to financial inclusion. And it's usually the entry point, right? It's the entry point for citizens into a financial system. So, once you've entered the financial system, I think it opens up a whole load of possibilities after that. So outside of the successes in India, which I'm sure my fellow panelists will get to as well, the success of the UPI is being discussed sort of around the world. There's also been successes in other jurisdictions. And one very early example is M-Pesa in Kenya. And it's probably kind of an example that we're all familiar with, but the M-Pesa being a mobile payment wallet offered to everyone who has a mobile phone in Kenya. And one particular study actually showed that the impact of introducing M-Pesa over a 6-year period, the result of that is consumption has seen to have grown, and some 2% of Kenyans were lifted out of poverty. And so that is kind of really interesting statistics, and there's more around these that we could draw on in terms of the benefit of financial market infrastructure being invested in, particularly digital payment infrastructure, and the benefit it has to the economy. So that's on the domestic level, but the world is also more connected than ever, and cross-border payments and cross-border trade for SMEs, for employment, for education, for travel is on the rise. And again, digital payment infrastructure that is seamless on a cross-border level is really important too. One of the key examples in this particular space are countries with large migrant workers base, a large migrant worker base, for example, and the benefit to those countries of inward remittances. Again, how it contributes to financial inclusion. So the region in Asia, in particular, and India has been, one of the key countries that spearheaded some of this work, have looked at innovative ways in which cross-border payments can be improved. And one of those examples is the interlinkages of instant payment systems on a bilateral basis. And I don't know whether Dilip is going to talk a little bit more about that, but that's certainly something that has been spearheaded in Asia. Now, with looking at these bilaterally, we also took inspiration at the Innovation Hub and incubated a project, Project Nexus, which looks at these interlinkages being done on a multilateral basis. So then the benefit of these interlinkages can scale. And we've just launched the handover phase, the implementation phase of this. India, I'm very pleased to say, is part of that. We also have Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand, and the Philippines, and hopefully more countries to join. And again, looking at sort of the benefit, we're starting with remittance payments. Very important, like I said, for those countries on the receiving end of remittances. And the benefit of, you join once and you can benefit from everybody else actually, coming into the network, and that network effects will really be, will really manifest. So the idea is that we start with remittance payments, but then we can move on to QR codes, merchant payments, and other use cases. And so up until this point, I've referenced examples that use existing technologies. I mean, these are technologies that have been around for a while, and we've seen so much growth in these in these sort of technologies and these structures. But there's also new technologies coming out. I mentioned earlier the harnessing sort of blockchain technology and the benefits that brings in terms of tokenization, atomic settlement, composability, programmability. I think all of those are areas that we're seeing central banks really embracing and starting to experiment with. And again, I think there are examples in India, there are examples all around the world, and there's a lot of experimentation. A recent survey that CPMI also put out to central banks have shown that central banks experimenting with central bank digital currencies is on the rise as well, whether it's research, proof of concepts, pilots, or indeed, live implementations. And of note, actually, there's four.
You have a minute more, please.
Thank you. 1 minute?
Yeah.
So of note, the live implementations are on retail CBDCs, and some of the real benefits of retail CBDCs in that survey has shown that central banks are putting them out for financial inclusion purposes. So I wasn't planning to go into any detail in that, and I will end my comments by saying that whilst all of these are opportunities that are out there, every opportunity, particularly on this scale, when we look at digital market infrastructure or any type of critical national infrastructure, all these opportunities also carry risks. And it's really important to kind of consider when we are looking at these technologies that we are keeping the risks in our line of sight, and hopefully being able to then implement them in a way that's going to benefit society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And when we come back to you, we probably will probe a little further on your observation that payment is a gateway to financial inclusion. And you spoke about M-Pesa. Maybe you could elaborate a little more later when we come back to you, and also specifically the work that BIS could be doing with respect to financial inclusion for SMEs in particular. So now I turn the floor over to Ms. Lubisi to speak about the South African experience with respect to harnessing DPI for financial inclusion. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Am I audible?
Audible, I'm very clear. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning from South Africa and good afternoon in New Delhi. I'd first like to begin by saying that the digital transformation is in essence not a new concept in South Africa. Government has actually been working on building capacity to support this evolution for more than 20 years now. But what has been the challenge on our side has been that the coordination and working in silos between the various institutions has made it very difficult for South Africa to basically keep up the pace and be on par with its peers such as India and Rwanda and Brazil. So what we also see is that during the COVID pandemic, what we did in South Africa, we introduced what we call the social relief of distress grants. That is for people who were unemployed at the time. And we then had certain conditions around that social grant. And then one of them basically is a broad one. We had to basically satisfy ourselves as government that the people that will be accessing this grant are in actual the most vulnerable in society. So we had a lot of eligibility criteria and process of onboarding the deserving beneficiaries for this grant. And one of them was that all applications had to be done electronically. That was the first condition that was in place. And then the other one was around citizenship. You had to be a South African citizen or a permanent resident. And if you were refugees, you needed to be registered with Home Affairs. You then needed to satisfy that you are in essence unemployed, that is not receiving any income of any sort. And then you also needed to also then satisfy the other requirements around that you are not receiving any form of other government support, whether it's from the National Student Financial Aid Scheme or any other form of social grant or relief that the government had introduced at the time. So this became some form of criteria that we actually needed as policymakers to satisfy that a candidate will, in essence, comply with before we can disperse this grant. So what you then see with all these conditionalities at a glance already is that we as policymakers basically then needed to find a way of interfacing with various systems which are within government, which most of the time seldom talk to each other. So this was basically dispersed from the Ministry of Social Development. We have the Social Security Agency, which has their own system, the Department of Home Affairs, when we talk about your citizenship status. So we had to interface around issues of your identity as an individual. We had to look at the revenue services. We needed to look at those systems that are at the South African Revenue Services. Then we needed to interface again with the National Student Financial Aid Schemes, as well as another system which is with the Department of Labor under the Ministry of Labor, which is the Unemployment Insurance Fund. So we, in essence, needed to find a way of linking up with all these systems. However, then, because the systems are not integrated, and then you also see that they do not fit into a centralized system, and they do not easily link to the South African identity system, it became a bit of a challenge for South Africa to actually disperse this grant in essence with ease. So there were a bit of hiccups. So what we then realized that, and at that point then in South Africa, was that there is then a need and there is a case for South Africa to look into India's DPI stack approach and actually look at how in South Africa we can move about implementing what has been done in India and Brazil going forward. Because the movement or the traction around that work has at the time had been slow. And actually where we are now currently, we are still at what I would say inception phase, where we have already established a committee which will look into spearheading this work. And it is actually a committee which is between two departments, which sits with us at the National Treasury. And then there's another component which sits with the Private Office of the President. So another thing that we also then realized with South Africa is when you look at DPI, for example, is the issue of remittances. So when you look at our Zimbabwe and South Africa corridor, cross-border corridor, what you find there is that there are still a lot of challenges with that particular corridor. And one of the issues that we are grappling with is that we have a fragmented environment of a closed loop remittance system. Then this one, which then basically hinders consumer choice at the moment. So what you see is that our customers are actually forced to receive funds using a remittance network system, which is chosen by the senders, but have limited availability to other networks in the regions. So what the National Payment Systems Department at the South African Reserve Bank has been doing is they've been on a drive of saying we need to drive and promote interoperability in South Africa. And we then also feel that by virtue of us implementing, going on a DPI type of an approach, this will help well, because it will help us to actually then solve that element around making sure that our systems are actually interoperable. So to this end, it brings us to then what then we presented last week in Rio at the last plenary of the GPFI under the Brazilian presidency. So what we have then said is that going forward, there is a recognition of DPFI as being an instrument that can help us solve our persistent last mile challenges. And we believe that
you have a minute, please. Thank you.
Yes, to this end, we have then proposed 2 presidential priorities for next year. And one of them is around moving from access to usage. And that is where we feel digital public infrastructures will play into being. And then we are also looking at the issue of remittances very closely. We would like to look at how can South Africa further work around reducing the costs of our remittances, as well as in actual fact, promoting basically and enhancing remittance flows, particularly looking at also that Zimbabwean corridor. Thanks.
thank you very much. When we talk to you later, please, we'll come back to you on the considerable efforts you seem to have taken to integrate systems within the country, avoid leakages, and avoid making payments to undeserving beneficiaries, and also your exercise in linking up the South African identity system with the uh, digital infrastructure. And of course, lastly, we will also ask you to elaborate on South African priorities in this space for the next G20 presidency when we come back to you. So now I turn the floor over to Mr. Dilip Aspe, who's I think the payment systems in India are setting newer and newer records every month for transactions volume, etc. So how he's coping with it, managing, and how he's ensuring that the system functions without glitches, and what are his future plans for international linkages, etc. So over to you, Dilip.
So the India has taken DPIs very seriously last, if I may say so, 10 years. And when you look at a country, such a diverse country like India having a DPI, there are many things has to come right. Many things has to come right. And if I have to just introspect, why India could deliver DPIs, is three primarily reasons I could think of. The first reason is the government and the regulator has been very clear that we need these DPIs in the payment systems, and we want to take payment systems access to the masses. Before NPCI, before DPIs, the payment system was used by predominantly the well-to-do and the rich in that sense. With the UPIs, with the other payment systems, it has democratized back to even to the last mile Aadhaar-enabled payment systems. So I think the government, RBI, were very clear, and they put up the rules, regulations which were innovation-led. They created the policy, enabling policies to drive this adoption and usage of payment systems. The second thing I can talk about is the whole architecture of Indian payment system encompassing the fintech, startups, and banks, so that the diverse ecosystem players could come inside and play their role. So, for example, the fintechs could give a very good apps, and a whole system has been interoperable from day zero. So it provided a level playing field opportunity to the banks, fintech, startups to provide the services back to the consumers. And the third thing I can talk about, as CA spoke about, that the platform has evolved. The platform which was launched in 2016 and platform which operates today, it has evolved every year. Just to give you a few examples, that even anything you try to keep it static, it kind of fades out. The ecosystem loses the interest. Because of this whole continuous evolution process of DPI, it has kept it going and it has kept on expanding. So if I have to just speak about, today, scale standpoint, we do about 1 billion consumer initiated transactions on a daily basis, both financial and non-financial. And to process those billion transactions, we do about 10 to 15 billion APIs, which is 1,500 crore APIs on a daily basis back with the ecosystem. So you can understand the scale of the infra and the sensitivity with the delays or latencies that those kind of things can arise back on that infra. The second is the features. We have been consistently adding the features on the platform, and variety of features like when you look at the credit, the credit has been launched on UPI. Both the credit cards can be added on UPI, also the credit line can be added on UPI. So that kind of gives, while the customer can use his own funds in the bank accounts, now we can also borrow the funds and attach that funds back to UPI to spend it on a merchant location. We have launched the QR for mandates. Today the recurring payments are given by UPI, and the scale is growing month on month. In fact, every month we do about 25 recurring mandates given by 25 million approved recurring mandates given by consumers to the merchants like Netflix of the world and OTT players and the other players. Also, we are in the process of launching the EMI on QR code, which is again work in process. Again, it's a standard functionality taking advantage of the software of the QR design. So variety of things has been done in last few years, and it's still growing. recently in the Global FinTech Festival, we also launched the delegated payments, and this is coming back to your point on financial inclusion. Today, if you look at India, about 900 million adults, about 500 to 700 million smartphones. We see about 400 million users, unique users on UPI. In fact, our daily active users are only next to WhatsApp in India. That's what we understand from an overall perspective. So delegated payments will actually help to get, my daughter who may not want to add the UPI account, so I can allocate some limits to make some transactions at the merchant location. I can give it to my house help to buy groceries from the market. So I can assign a limit, and the delegated payments, that is another way to keep on expanding the UPI who do not want to expose their bank account or do not have the ability to deal with the UPI related payment. So that's another way to look at it. And the other things, I think we'll talk about it in due course. So I put alarms so that you don't have to remind me.
I think he set the alarm 1 minute before the dedicated 7 minutes. But Dilip, I think you spoke a lot about the fact that the system that began in 2016, 8 years later, it has evolved. It could have petered out, but then so many innovations were added in the course of the last 8 years that kept it going and growing as well. So I think maybe you could talk about some of the important, very defining milestones later. And the second point I wanted to leave with is more of a slightly, pre-lunch provocative question. Has the ease of digital payments in the country, in your understanding, has it encouraged too much of frivolous spending? So that's just more to liven up the pre-lunch session. So now I'm going to turn to the last but not the least speaker, my colleague in the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Chanchal Sarkar. And I already introduced him to you. So over to you.
Thank you, Chair Sir. And I also thank ICRIER and Mr. Dr. Mishra in particular for inviting me and giving this opportunity. So I have an advantage for being the last one. So I'll try to essentially start with since we are fresh from the last meeting, day before yesterday, we had ended our discussion in G20. I'll keep that perspective also. Now, financial inclusion, particularly digital financial inclusion, help in facilitating achieving SDGs 7 out of 17. So that's the importance. Now, when it was started, around 2.5 billion people were outside of the formal financial system. Today, we have around 1.4 billion. Day before yesterday, we came to know that around 1.5 billion people are still outside. And the significant achievement have been made in terms of access across the globe, especially the emerging countries. But still, there are a lot of work to be done. Now, the issue is that there are within G20, there are significant voices that they think that we have achieved quite a bit in terms of access. Now we need to work on certain other things like financial well-being or financial health in the financial. So therefore, like financial, which has been the case under the Brazilian presidency, that we have worked on 3 deliverables. One of them is financial well-being, and 2 of them under the FIAP, which was decided under Indian presidency, is the digital financial inclusion, the last mile options, and the SME financing. As you know, that the SME financing has been an issue, that even today around 5.5 trillion US dollar is the gap in the SME finance. And also keeping in mind the problems in the last miles, we kept the last mile policy options. So now, whether we like it or not, the discussions on financial well-being will be here for some more time. And if we take the South African presidency, you have heard that they will be working in exactly the same line of access to usage. And then after that, the US presidency, and there are indications they would like to further the financial well-being and the other concept to work. Now, how this DPI can help the last mile, which are the major challenges. Now, the issue is what is the DPI? DPI, many of us, we sometimes we understand that these are the technology. The DPI is much more than technology. So this is an ecosystem where it gives the opportunity to solve many societal problems in a holistic manner, and also by ensuring the market participation, by ensuring that these can work for both private and public, both the emerging countries as well as the developed countries alike. Now, the issue is how it works, because by definition, it is the interoperable, inclusive, and also safe, and these are scalable. The kind of problems we face, the kind of the last mile challenges with both the demand side as well as the supply side, like the high transaction costs, the geographical location and population. So these can very well be addressed by DPI approach, which would not only ensure access, because essentially the financial inclusion has three dimensions: access, usage, and equality. So that DPI can actually leapfrog the access by these three foundational foundational thing, which is verifiable digital identity, low cost payment, and there's data exchange consent base. So they have enormous potential, which is quite evident from the India's case. And also we can see some of the emerging countries as well as developed countries that this DPI approach has worked. Like, for example, today in India, we see that UPI that every day around 500 million transactions, and what we have achieved as per the BIS in terms of market, opening account opening penetration from roughly around 20% to around 85% in a span of 9 years, which would have taken around 47, 48 years. So so also, like today, out of the total digital payment, UPI constitutes around 80%. Similarly, Brazil's PIX also significantly has come up, and also the 40% of their payments are through their peaks. Similarly, some of the emerging countries and some of the LDCs also, Bangladesh, then Thailand, and Philippines, all are also working. Now, the advantage of the DPI is that these can solve the problems at scale, because the enormous amount of problems we are having. So these would perhaps be the appropriate. In this context, I would also like to share the kind of the keenness from various global South countries shows that these DPIs, demand for DPIs are increasing. Okay, let me stop here.
Thank you, Chanchal. I think when we come back to you, we would like to hear from you as to how you saw the Brazilian presidency, for the benefit of the audience, not now, but when you come back to you, how did the Brazilian presidency take forward the Indian agenda? And what is the kind of expectations that you have for the South African presidency on the DP agenda? We'll come back to you later. So let me first go back to our first speaker, Ms. Dimaki. And so as I mentioned to you, with respect to the innovation hub of the BIS in Singapore, what is it that the BIS is working on specifically with respect to advancing the cause of financial inclusion for small and medium enterprises?
I think we look at financial market infrastructure for the benefit of all. So SMEs would be kind of one beneficiary of that. We have some targeted in the BIS Innovation Hub, and we have 7 centers around the world. We have a few targeted ones on SME financing. Project Dynamo particularly looks at that, and the idea is that we look at sort of the concept of tokenization, programmability of money, and transferability of those tokens to allow or to give confidence for financiers to actually finance small to medium enterprises. And this was a prototype. I think there's a lot more that we could do in this space. I think looking at technologies, I think alone, it was mentioned already, is not enough. There's a lot more to how we solve these problems than just how the technology works. And I think we should recognize things like, liquidity, the foreign exchange, compliance processes. And so when we're looking at sort of building a digital public infrastructure, particularly in financial services, there's a lot more to it than just whether the technology works. I mean, what is the risk framework around these things? And on a cross-border basis, it becomes a lot more difficult. And so we're looking at harnessing sort of the technology, particularly programmability of money, and this concept of tokenization to kind of create some trust in the system, if you like. But there's a lot more to it than that, and I think we should really recognise that. A lot of our other projects actually talk to SMEs and obviously retail consumers as well as wholesale consumers will benefit from. A lot of our work in wholesale central bank digital money, particularly multi CBDCs on a platform and the cross-border payment element of that. And again, looking at how do we take advantage of the technologies and what it offers. So Project Enbridge is an example of that. We're also just launched a project on tokenization, which will really it advocates sort of tokenized deposits at a commercial bank level with central bank digital currency in the background as the safe settlement asset. And again, that cross-border transactions can then be made safer. The cost comes down, and potentially support kind of the SME sort of transactions, if you like, rather than specifically financing.
Thank you.
There's a
so we will come back
of
to
projects.
Sorry to interrupt you. We'll come back to the rest of the additional measures you mentioned. Also, you spoke about the fact that it is not just about technology, it's also other things and behavioral in nature. So we will probably take up on that because we are keeping one eye on the clock, and that is why I had to interrupt. My apologies to you for that. So I'm going to go back to Ms. Lubisi, and you spoke about the South African identity system and the link-up integration with various systems, and how far we have succeeded in A, enabling maximum possible coverage, and B, eliminating frauds. And also you spoke about the South Africa-Zimbabwe corridor, and is there other plans to extend it to other countries? In what way it is sort of is there any case study on the improvement or the impact it has had on the livelihoods of the people who are benefiting from the South African Zimbabwe corridor? So these two questions, I would like to seek your responses. Thank you. We are not hearing you. Probably you are on mute. Could you please unmute yourself? Or
I am unmuted. Am I audible?
You're audible now. Thank you. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yes. So with regards to the digital identity program, so the project is being led by the Department of Home Affairs, and it has, in essence, kickstarted, I would say, but there's still a lot of work that still needs to be done between the Treasury and us, in essence, having that close-knit relationships. So I would say, in terms of where we are currently, we are still at an infancy phase, and we have been, for instance, when we started on composing like the interdepartmental working committee that will work on DPI have reached out to the department, for instance, to actually check on what has been done, what is the direction going forward. But there is still a need to sort of like establish a firm relationship with the Home Affairs Department. So I would say at this stage, you're not really going to see much traction on it, but I know that the work has already started on that side. And with the remittances, I spoke mostly about the Zimbabwean corridor, and it is of big interest to South Africa because they are actually quite close to us, and there has been a huge amount of flows between in that corridor, and that's why we always normally zoom into that. But there are already studies that have been done on that particular corridor. There's a Finmark Trust that has been doing work on analyzing that particular corridor. We recently also, about a month ago, had a visit from the IMF, who is also interested in looking at what are the inefficiencies around that corridor and how we can then improve on the sort of like the loopholes that are currently there. But in terms of whether we will extend to other corridors, yes, we will. But it's just that this one is one that is for us a more urgent, and we normally always would then highlight it most of the time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your succinct responses to that. So we'll come back to you with any additional clarifications later. I'm going to turn to Dilip now. Dilip, as I mentioned to you, once you finish your initial remarks, so what do you see as the pivotal moments in the last 8 years that kind of increased the usage? And second, of course, I asked you about frivolous spending, but you decide which order you want to go.
Yeah. So, I think I'm a technology person, so I'll take an innovation route first. So, yeah, when we look at the last few years, I think one of the big game changers for UPI has been this whole combination of I can do a P2P, P2M together, right? So conceptualizing this like a digital payment system, because most of the Western world is familiar with the real-time payments rail. So I think that architecture kind of helped us in a big way. So the consumer could do the merchant payment as well as the P2P. The second part I could talk about, I spoke about the recurring payments. I think it has been a really good uptake in last 3 years' time. We see that 25 million new mandates given by the consumers every month, and the usage for the OTT subscription, some of the small ticket collection items has been growing a lot. The IPO subscription, UPI also has a block functionality. Right now, you would start seeing it more in usage, but first it started using IPO, and about 60% of new IPOs are applied on UPI now in the primary markets. The other thing which I'm talking about is the credit. The credit has been growing. The traditional way has been giving a physical card and consumer trying to use that. Now today on any of the bank apps, you can go and you can get a digital card, which you can link it on UPI directly, right? And with this whole UPI, RuPay credit card, UPI credit and RuPay credit card on UPI, we are seeing about 10% of the credit spends are already migrated on UPI now, right? So we do about 20,000 crore per month spends on credit, right? And it's growing, and our aspiration is to get it to a lakh plus crore monthly basis. The third thing, which I think is the delegate payment, I spoke about it also before, right? It will kind of help to people to adopt in digital payment. It can be a training ground. That's the way I look at it, and for the kids, even starting from who has a smartphone can look at it. Obviously, I think, when I look at overall UPI, we still have a lot of growth left, right? So I think there is no point in looking at the past, but I think we as a country, if we are able to do, if we are not able to do 100 billion transactions a month, right, we are at about just 14, 15 billion. So I think this 8x growth is still very much possible. And I think as a country, we must look at, and there are few things required. There's few policy changes or some infrastructural changes would be required. The first one is, I think, as a country, we must start thinking that how do we get a smartphone to every Indian's hand, right? I think that can change the game for the way not only the financial services, but also the content, education, and variety of other things which can be used and consumed by the Indian. That's a skill up game, right? So I think this is one big thing which I think all of us should work at. How do we get $100 phone, Android phone, which goes back to every Indian's hand by some way or the other, by either by giving a EMI scheme or either by giving as a part of the subsidized value from the government or the stakeholders' contribution. The second part is you spoke about the consumption and expenditure. It goes without saying, right? Because when you have a cash-based economy, right, you carry the cash to the retailer, right? You carry the cash. So your budget is the cash, right? You look at and how much cash you can carry, right? The digital payments, your bank account balance becomes your budget, right? So it has been seen in not only in India, but variety of places that the consumption in the economy has increased after the digital payments, apart from the transparency and the other tax collection, those kind of the other advantages. But I think the consumption has improved. But I think what we should look at is how do we drive 500 million credit to Indians to get a credit using the UPI. I think that's the objective we should look at, and that will drive the capacity with the citizens.
So thank you, Dilip. I think you mentioned about the fact that we have to get $100 smartphones into people's hands, and in a lighter vein, or semi-lighter vein, I must add that the Sapien Lab in ICRIER University down south has come out with the research, and I wrote about it also in Indian Express together with the head of the Sapien Labs, that smartphones, when they are introduced at a very young age to population, together with the screen time, social media, English language, and consumption of ultra-processed foods, actually increases mental anxiety and depression, and also suicidal tendencies and so on. So we need to offset the trade-off between this. In fact, and on top of that, if they end up on top of it, if they end up spending more money than they have, that also is a problem. So I think we need to be clear about the trade-offs involved here. So I think let me turn to Chanchal. So how did you see Indian presidency's priorities? How did they go forward in Brazil? And what is your dialogue or conversation with the South African counterparts as they get prepared to take on the next presidency? So for the benefit of the audience, in very brief manner, could you share the journey between India to Brazil to South African presidency on DPI priorities?
Thank you very much. In fact, as I indicated, that in Brazil there are three major deliverables due under their presidency this year. One of them is presidency priority that I'll come later. Like two of them is the Financial Inclusion Action Plan, which is 3 years document, as per which the works of GPFI is undertaken. Now, this FIAP of 3 years was deliberated and adopted under India's presidency. So therefore, two deliverables were pre-decided, which was under India's presidency. So one of them was like last mile access policy options, with the major DPI element in it through DPI. And second one was the SME financing action plan through various innovative technologies, where also a huge amount of DPI elements are there. So therefore, two major documents which are due this year has a significantly large portion of DPI elements in both the. And on the third, which is the financial well-being they are pursuing. One of the reasons why they came, that Brazilian presidency says what you just pointed out. They say that the easy money and these fintech the easy loan has given rise to a huge indebtedness. So therefore, there is the financial inclusion should also take into account the financial well-being rather than but then again the counter argument is that what is the guarantee that if these people were not given the loan from the formal sector, they would be dependent on the informal sector. So therefore, there will be more harsher. There will be for the condition adversities maybe. So therefore, and another thing is the consumption. When the consumption goes, the multiplier effects and employment.
No, I have to interrupt you just very quickly. So you are right. If they didn't take these loans, they would have gone to the money lenders and taken at a much higher cost of borrowing. So here what may happen is that you could have much greater volume of borrowing at a much lower cost because the cost is seemingly low. So you may end up taking more loans than you could handle. So there are always arguments on either side. If the cost is too high, then obviously you go and borrow from the money lender only when it's absolutely necessary. But here it is so cheap, so accessible, so instantaneous compared to your other option. You may end up not keeping a control on how much you are borrowing. So I think there are arguments on both sides. So
yes, absolutely true.
Go ahead.
So that's what, and then what the South African my colleague Nonto just mentioned. So they have pointed out, which are very, very important, that as I said, that financial inclusion has three dimensions. One is access, one is usage, another is quality. Now they are going very much from the access to usage, and this can be achieved with the DPI element in a significant way. So therefore, the South African priorities is exactly in line with the financial inclusion, in fact, universal financial inclusion. And second thing, the remittances is already committed by our leaders to reduce it by 3% by 2030, which would be an enabler for the SDGs. So both the priorities are identified by the South Africa. It falls well within the domain of this financial inclusion group, as well as can be facilitated significantly by the DPI.
Thank you, Chanchal, and I might thank all the four participants for their second round of responses. Of course, one of the issues that we confront, and I think I'm not addressing it to any one of the participants specifically, but while DPI lowers the cost of remittances, transfers, and also forex hedging, as Ms. Dimaki mentioned for SMEs, of course, the best financial inclusion is for the SME in particular is to get their large corporate buyers to pay on time. And I don't think DPI can really assist in that, right? So, but we have about 10 minutes to go, and I would like to invite the audience to ask their questions. And I do see a couple of hands here. Mr. Gentleman here to my right rather.
Thank you. I'm A.K. Jain. I'm from the urban sector. Very nice for presentations, no doubt about it, with your very wise interventions. The question which is bothering me is that by 2047, Indian economy will be third largest in the world with $36 trillion economy. And the population of India will be around 1,640 crores. Or million, million. So 50%, 75% of the population will be in the urban areas, 25% will be in the rural areas. Now, my problem is that the rural, the GDP of India by 2047 will be coming 75% from the urban areas, 25% of the rural areas. This gives a very, very alarming thing that we are discriminating among the rural areas because their income will be 1/3 of the average urban income. So what is the thought? And this is a very good opportunity, Rio de Janeiro summit, that we can discuss about these things and see how we can energize the rural sector, rural economy in particular. And perhaps we can also learn something from Muhammad Yunus, the advisor of Bangladesh, who started Grameen banks and things, dedicated programs for them.
So what is exactly the question?
The question is that how we are going to reconcile the inequity between the urban sector and the rural sector?
No, I think the session is focused on the digital infrastructure, digital payment, and the financial inclusion. And I think the topic that you are proposing is for Deepak to consider for the next seminar. I think on addressing urban-rural inequity and income gap, etc. And I don't think this time, that the limited time we have, will enable us to go into a fuller discussion of your question. But the point is well taken. Can we, Harsha? You can also ask question to Anand. No, moderator has the right to remain silent.
Thank you, sir. This is Harsha Bhomik. I'm the Director of Fintech from Ministry of Finance, India. I just had two questions actually, but I will just make it very brief.
To whom?
One to Ms. Dimaki and one to Mr. Asbe.
Okay.
So first question is basically we had a lot of potential on tokenization, which I think Ms. Dimaki also has elaborated. So we have seen a lot of risk and reward on tokenization. So if because she is actually working on the BIS Innovation Hub and working with so many central banks, so I want to just have her view on what are the different kind of risk on the tokenization and whether the risk is more on the retail side or more on the commercial side, considering the fungibility of fungibility increment due to tokenization. Is there a risk of bank run, financial stability, and what are those aspects? Very short.
I think that's a good question. We should let her respond first before you ask your second question to Dilip, right?
So I think it depends. Thank you for the question. I think it really depends on kind of the application of tokenization. I'll start with the big picture, which is it is new technology. I think the legal frameworks around this, the liability frameworks haven't been defined, and these frameworks are really important. So whilst we test that the technology works in terms of the outcome that we're looking to achieve, we at scale, we need to ensure that we have looked at all of the legal, regulatory compliance, everything that keeps us safe. And that work hasn't been done on many of these technologies yet. That's on a big picture. And then if I drill down into, and I'll be very quick, if I drill down into things like wholesale, the wholesale area versus retail area, there are different types of risks that manifest in those sort of different realms. It's too much to go into. We don't have much time at all, but I'm very happy to take it offline. There are risks in both of those which can be unique.
Thank you very much for your second question. Quickly.
Yeah, very quickly. This is a very novice question. I think we hear it from many of us, like we are so much of volume in UPI right now, but still because it's a financial inclusion conclave, so still we need a debit card, we need a phone number and a smartphone to enroll for UPI.
No, we have already added Aadhaar.
I know. What are the other options? If I
Aadhaar.
give
Aadhaar.
Yeah, so only
and we are now adding, so Aadhaar OTP is right now live. We are adding the Aadhaar face as well now. We're working with UIDI to add the Aadhaar face as part of the onboarding journey of UPI. So then you just need a bank account and Aadhaar. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Any other question from the audience? There's a gentleman there. Can you please pass the mic on to him?
Hello. I think somehow we have left population growth behind in the inclusiveness and everything. Because when we analyze anything, everything boils down to the growth of population. And the population growth rate is very high in African continent, in most of the countries. And, one of the solutions, I would like your comment on this, sir. One of the solutions which I think is that all the benefits should be restricted to the people having not more than 3 children or 4 children at the most in African countries, and maybe 3 children in other countries. How do you react to this?
So I couldn't fully grasp the question. What's the question? So, but population growth in India, if it slows down towards the sort of the second half of the current century, that probably is the way societies have progressed in general, as societies become prosperous, the need for more hands automatically declines and population growth rate slows down. But we do have, at this point, before the demographic peak is hit, we have about 2 to 3 decades, depending on your assumptions, maybe 2 decades, not 3, when we can actually reap the benefits of the current bulge in the working age population that will happen between now and 2045 or so. So for it to continue to sustain at that rate will be probably even counterproductive from many other considerations, right? So I think in the interest of time, we probably should not go on to a conversation which we can take offline. I see another hand in the back. Yeah, we have.
Thank you. This was a very good session. UPI has been impacting our lives.
And is your question addressed to?
Sorry?
Your question is addressed to?
Anyone and everyone, actually. It's a very general question. And in simple terms, I would just want to know, while UPI is great and it's enhanced our life in many ways, many positive ways, and it's an example to the whole world to show what is possible digitally in terms of payments, right? I would just want to know, how long do you think UPI will take to reduce the cash transactions in the country? You know, the kind of cash in circulation right now, it's not falling. Correct me if I'm wrong. It might be on the constant, it's not falling. And as an person from the academics, I would expect, you know, that UPI should reduce, make an impact on the amount of cash in circulation. Thank you.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think this is our goal. I think if this is what we are working towards, and I think like other developed countries, the India should be in a single digit of GDP to cash ratio. We are at 13%, but I think I've started seeing the positive outcomes on that. RBI started printing the lower denomination notes. The rate has of the lower, and UPI is predominantly attacking the lower denominations in that sense. Yes. Right? Because the cash has another use, which is storage. That UPI cannot solve, right? Because the storage of the cash can come from a variety of other reasons. But I think there is a positive movement on that. And I think in next 3 to 5 years' time, we must aspire to be a single digit cash to GDP to cash ratio.
I think that's a very good question to end this session with, because human tendency is to take any good thing and push it to the point of maximum disgust. And that the same applies to technology or any innovation. But why should cash usage be completely extinguished? It is good to have a certain share of cash transactions. It gives me anonymity and there is a privacy, because if we push everything digital, then we also have to worry about the surveillance state everywhere in the world. So I think, I would rather think we need to keep all our options open. So I think that's a good note on which to end this session. I'm going to waive my right to make some closing remarks. Sorry? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for an insightful discussion. I would request the panelists and the chair to remain on the podium for the concluding remarks. To conclude this year's edition of ICRIER's G20 conference, I'm pleased to invite Dr. Peter Morgan, Senior Consulting Economist and Advisor to the Dean of ADBI, to deliver the vote of thanks. Dr. Morgan previously served as ADBI's Vice Chair of Research. Prior to this, he was the Chief Asia Economist for HSBC, where he was responsible for macroeconomic analysis and forecasting in Asia. Let me also mention here, ADBI has been one of our partners for this conference and has been supporting ICRIER since many years in our G20 work, particularly our past conferences. Over to you, sir.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it's been our great pleasure at ADBI to support this G20 conference since 2010. As well as our more recent collaboration with ICRIER on G20 related topics, which has been ongoing for about 3 years. So today we had a very rich discussion on 2 of the Indian presidency's priorities, the MDB reforms and the digital public infrastructure. Regarding MDBs, we found that they've embarked on a significant reform of themselves, but the results of their efforts perhaps continue to fall short of stakeholders' expectations. So this session brought together thoughtful discussion on the following issues: the feasibility of far-reaching reform of MDBs in the current geopolitical context, how the rise of the global south, especially the expansion of the NDB bank, is affecting the pace of NDB reforms, why the targets of private capital mobilization in particular seem to be the most difficult, and why MDB reforms may continue to languish without deep-rooted governance reforms, and finally, how working with MDBs looks from the ground up. So overall, although there has been progress, including climate, in the mandates of the MDBs, changes in other areas, the general area of better, bolder, and broader, I think those changes have been incremental as opposed to transformative, and the stakeholders themselves need to become more proactive. We had a very interesting discussion on the role of digital public infrastructure in advancing objectives of financial inclusion, and there was emphasis particularly on the payment system as the road to financial inclusion. So the discussion focused on issues like how DPIs can address the persistent last mile challenges in financial inclusion for individuals and MSMEs, perhaps especially the latter, and how to reduce costs. The importance of smartphones was also mentioned. Secondly, how infrastructure and the regulation complements can help accelerate digital financial inclusion, and the issue of governance and the issues of government agencies operating in silos was highlighted. The importance of low-cost, interoperable cross-border infrastructure for remittances, and finally, the necessary risk frameworks to protect vulnerable communities from systemic risks of cyber frauds, mis-selling, and perhaps most importantly, excessive borrowing. So in conclusion, I'd like to congratulate the organizers at ICRIER for organizing an excellent and thought-provoking conference, including Dr. Deepak Mishra, Director and Chief Executive, and many others. I'd also like to thank Sri Amitabh Kant, Sri Ajay Seth, and Anantha Nageswaran, and all the other moderators, panelists, and discussants. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. With this, we close our conference, and I'd like to invite everyone for lunch, please. Thank you.